The morning my father came to sign the biggest deal of his career, he walked into our Washington boardroom looking like a man who had already won. Henry Langford wore the same dark navy suit he saved for television interviews and lender meetings, the one that made him look broader through the shoulders and 10 years younger from across a conference table. He shook hands with the attorneys, nodded to the executives from the investment consortium, and placed his leather folder in front of the chair marked with his name. 5 years earlier, that same man had looked me in the face and told me that if I married Andre Mitchell, I would no longer have a place in his family or his company. Andre was black. My father called that a problem of background and fit, until I forced him to say what he really meant. Then he said the sentence I never forgot: "He'll never be one of us." Now my father was sitting beneath the Cedar Bridge logo, waiting for the final authorization that would refinance his debt, fund the acquisition he had spent years chasing, and preserve the company he called his legacy. He knew Andre was one of Cedar Bridge's managing partners. What he did not know was who had been designated to sign the closing documents. The boardroom doors opened behind me. Andre walked in with closing counsel at his side, and every executive at the table stood. My father's hand stopped halfway to his water glass. Andre took the empty chair at the end of the table, opened the final authorization packet, and my father finally understood whose signature he needed. Before I tell you how my father ended up needing the approval of the man he once said would never belong in our family, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because what happened in that room began 5 years earlier, with one sentence, one corporate record, and a lie my father thought would stay buried forever. And if stories about family, betrayal, and consequences are your kind of stories, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the end. 8 weeks before that closing, I had no idea Langford Commercial Group was about to enter my professional life again. By then, I was 39 and had spent nearly 5 years helping build Cedar Bridge Partners into something Andre and I once could barely describe without sounding overly ambitious. We were not billionaires sitting on some private mountain of cash. Cedar Bridge managed institutional capital. Andre had brought relationships from his years in infrastructure finance and capital markets, while I had built the operating structure that kept those relationships from turning into expensive mistakes. I was our chief operating officer and an equity partner, and most of my work was invisible when things went right. That was fine with me. Systems were supposed to be invisible when they worked. The morning Langford crossed my desk, I was reviewing a potential conflict involving a subcontractor tied to one of our portfolio companies. Someone had flagged the vendor because one of our senior managers had invested in a business owned by the vendor's brother. The amount involved was small enough that nobody would have noticed if our screening system had been weaker. I noticed. I stopped the approval, sent it to compliance, and asked for an independent review before the contract went any further. One of our newer directors joked that I had turned a routine vendor form into a federal investigation. I laughed because I had heard some version of that joke for years. My father used to make it too. Henry had always hated the layers of control I built at Langford. He liked judgment, instinct, handshakes, and knowing the person across the table. I liked records that could survive after everyone in the room changed their story. "You make everything harder than it needs to be," he once told me after I added a second approval to high-value vendor changes. At the time, I thought we were arguing about paperwork. I understand now that we were arguing about something much larger. I believed rules were most useful when they applied to everyone. My father believed rules were useful until they got in the way of someone he trusted. And the person Henry Langford trusted most was Henry Langford. The Langford transaction did not arrive as some dramatic file stamped with my family name. Cedar Bridge had already been approached through an investment bank about a regional commercial construction company seeking strategic capital. Our acquisitions team had reviewed preliminary numbers and decided the opportunity was worth moving into a deeper screening stage. That was when our risk intake came through operations. I was reading summaries between meetings when I opened the file and saw the full company name for the first time. Langford Commercial Group. My fingers stopped on the trackpad. For a moment, the office around me seemed farther away than it was. I could still hear phones, keyboards, someone laughing near the kitchen, but all of it flattened into background noise. The name on the screen took me somewhere I had spent 5 years refusing to revisit. I could see the Langford office in Richmond, the framed photographs in my father's hallway, the conference room where I had spent almost a decade becoming the person he said would someday help run the company. And then, I heard his voice from the last afternoon I worked there. Andre and I had been engaged for 4 months when my parents finally stopped pretending their objections were temporary. My mother had spent weeks asking whether we were rushing. My father asked questions about Andre's family that he had never asked about the white men Amanda dated. He wanted to know what kind of neighborhood Andre had grown up in, what his parents did, what kind of people attended the church his grandmother belonged to. Every question was technically polite. Every question carried the same message. Andre does not belong here. The confrontation happened in Henry's office in May of 2021. I had gone in, believing we were going to discuss a project schedule. My mother was already sitting near the window when I arrived, which should have warned me. Henry closed the door and told me there was still time to think clearly. I asked him what he wanted me to think about. He said marriage was not only about 2 people. It was about families, circles, expectations, and the future. I asked him to stop using vague words and say what he meant. He did. He'll never be one of us. I remember the silence afterward better than I remember shouting. I did not scream. Neither did Andre, because Andre was not there. That was important to my father. Henry wanted the conversation to happen without the man he was discussing as if he were a hostile acquisition. My mother told me not to make things uglier than they had to be. I looked at her and asked what exactly I was making ugly. She looked down. My father told me that if I went through with the wedding, I needed to understand there would be consequences. No family events, no financial support, no role in Langford's future. I had been director of operations for years by then. I had built procurement controls, vendor review systems, reporting procedures, and parts of the project oversight structure Henry used every day. None of that mattered once I refused to let him choose my husband. I told him I was marrying Andre. Henry said, "Then you're done here." I made him repeat himself because I wanted no ambiguity. "Are you firing me?" His jaw tightened. "If that's the word you want to use." "I'm not resigning." He looked at me as if the distinction irritated him. "Fine." That evening, I sent an email to Human Resources. I wrote it carefully because even then, some part of me understood that memory became fragile once people had reasons to remember things differently. To be clear, I am not resigning from Langford Commercial Group. I was informed today that my employment is being terminated because I intend to proceed with my marriage. I copied my personal email. Then I left. Back in my Cedar Bridge office 5 years later, I read the name Langford Commercial Group on our intake form 3 times before closing the file. The temptation to walk straight into Andre's office was strong, but training took over before emotion did. The company entering our process belonged to my father. My husband was a managing partner. I was the chief operating officer. That was a conflict before anyone had done anything wrong. I called our general counsel. "I need to disclose something before this goes any further." Within 20 minutes, we were in a conference room with the door closed. I told her exactly what the relationship was, and nothing more dramatic than necessary. Langford Commercial Group was my father's company. I had worked there until 2021. My departure had not been friendly. Andre was my husband. If Cedar Bridge continued reviewing the opportunity, both of us needed to be screened from decisions where our personal history could matter. She agreed immediately. I would have no role in the investment recommendation, pricing, committee vote, or negotiation strategy. Andre would also be screened from the investment committee vote and direct negotiations. Our head of acquisitions, outside counsel, and independent committee members would handle the deal. If Cedar Bridge eventually approved the investment, execution authority would be determined later under the fund's governing documents. I remember feeling relieved by how ordinary the process sounded. There was something comforting about rules that did not care who my father was. I went back to my desk and tried to work. That lasted less than an hour. One of our analysts sent me a procedural question because it touched historical ownership, not the investment recommendation itself. Langford had redeemed management equity from a former executive in 2021, and the ownership schedule did not reconcile cleanly with another set of historical records. The former executive was me. The analyst had no idea what the entry meant emotionally. To him, it was a line on a spreadsheet. "Can you confirm whether you voluntarily departed in May 2021?" he wrote. I stared at the sentence. Voluntarily departed. I opened the attached corporate history. There it was in a clean, professional line beneath my name. Jessica Langford, Director of Operations, voluntary departure. For the first time since I had seen the Langford name that morning, my reaction was not grief. It was suspicion. I knew exactly what I had said in my father's office. I knew what I had written to Human Resources that night. Memory can blur around emotion, but I did not need memory. I had documented it. I opened the personal archive I had carried across 3 laptops and 2 cloud accounts. Most of it was boring. Tax forms, insurance records, old contracts. A folder labeled Langford that I had not opened in years. I clicked through it until I found the email. My hands were colder than they should have been in a climate-controlled office. To be clear, I am not resigning. The timestamp was still there. The HR address was still there. My personal copy was still there. I read it once, then again. The analyst's attached record said I had voluntarily left the company. My own contemporaneous email said the opposite. That discrepancy might have been incompetence. It might have been a clerical shortcut. It might have been someone trying to make an ugly family dispute look cleaner on a corporate record. But my father had built a career out of telling people that details mattered when money was involved. And this detail involved my ownership in the company. I did not know yet what that meant. I did not know who had changed the wording or when. I did not know that one line would eventually force independent directors, outside lawyers, lenders, and my own husband's firm to reopen a decision Henry thought had been buried 5 years earlier. All I knew was that I had not resigned. Someone had written that I did. And for the first time in 5 years, I wanted to know why. I did not tell Andre about the email that afternoon. That was my first mistake. Not because I was trying to hide anything from him, and not because I had already decided my father had committed some kind of fraud. At that point, I had one old email, one line in a corporate history, and 5 years of anger I had worked very hard not to confuse with evidence. I told myself I needed facts before I dragged Andre into it. I told myself I was protecting Cedar Bridge from a family problem. The truth was less flattering. I had spent 5 years building a life in which Henry Langford could no longer surprise me. And the moment I saw that false record, I wanted control back before anyone else touched the situation. I closed my office door and opened the folder I had avoided since 2021. The first files were ordinary enough to make me feel foolish for being tense. Tax documents, a health insurance termination letter, a copy of my last pay stub, the paperwork from the attorney I had consulted after leaving Langford. Then I found the management equity file. I had forgotten how thick it was. Henry had granted me units over several years as part of an incentive plan for senior management. They were not enough to control anything. I had never had voting power that threatened him, but they represented real economic value. And at the time, Henry had spoken about them as proof that I was not merely his daughter working at his company. I was supposed to be part of its future. I started reading the plan from the beginning, this time as the chief operating officer of an investment firm, instead of a 34-year-old woman whose father had just thrown her out of her career. The distinction mattered. 5 years earlier, the language had looked like legal fog. Now I could follow the structure. The plan treated different departures differently. If an executive voluntarily resigned, the company could redeem certain units using a lower formula, based largely on book value and vesting status. If the executive was terminated without cause, the calculation was more favorable and incorporated a higher valuation measure. I sat back and stared at that section for a long time. Then, I pulled up the buyback notice from 2021. The number had bothered me at the time. I remembered that much. I had expected more, but by then, I was sleeping 4 hours a night. Andre and I were dealing with the fallout from my parents. and Cedar Bridge existed mostly as incorporation documents, pitch decks, and a collection of spreadsheets on our dining room table. When the buyback arrived, I had looked at the amount, felt sick, and told myself I could either spend the next year fighting Henry or build something he could never take away from me. So I took the money. 5 years later, with the plan open beside the buyback notice, I finally understood how the number had been reached. It matched the voluntary resignation formula. I made a new spreadsheet and began reconstructing the calculation. I used only documents I legally possessed. I entered the unit count, the vesting date, the company valuation data included with the redemption package, and the 2 formulas in the plan. I ran the numbers twice because the first result made me think I had made an error. I had not. The difference was more than $1 million. For several seconds, I simply watched the number sit there on the screen. It was strange how quickly something abstract became physical. $1 million was not just a number. Andre and I had delayed buying a home when we started Cedar Bridge because we wanted more capital available for the business. We had kept salaries lower than we could have justified. We had said no to things our friends were doing because every dollar we did not pull out gave the company more room to breathe. We had been fortunate. We had never been desperate. But those first 2 years had required choices. And somewhere in Richmond, a corporate record had classified me as a woman who had voluntarily walked away from her job. That classification had changed the amount I received when my ownership was redeemed. I did not feel vindicated. I felt stupid. The attorney I had met in 2021 came back to me with uncomfortable clarity. Her office had been small and cold, with framed certificates on one wall and a box of tissues positioned so carefully on the corner of her desk that I knew I was not the first person to sit there trying not to cry. She had reviewed the termination email, the equity documents I had brought, and the correspondence from Langford. She told me there were several issues worth examining. She also told me litigation against a family-controlled company could become expensive, invasive, and slow. There would be discovery, depositions, questions about why I had been terminated, questions about my father, questions about Andre. It could take a long time before I saw anything resembling resolution. She had not told me to give up. I chose to. At the time, I called it moving on. Looking back, I know I was exhausted. There is a difference. I did not make some noble decision that peace mattered more than money. I simply reached a point where every letter with the Langford name on it made my stomach tighten, and I wanted to build a morning that did not begin with my father. Andre had offered to fight beside me. I told him no. So when the buyback payment came, I deposited it. When the attorney asked whether I wanted to proceed, I declined. Then I packed the documents into a folder and buried them in a cloud archive where they could not demand anything else from me. I had believed leaving meant the story was over. Now I understood that Henry had been allowed to keep writing it after I stopped reading. I kept going through the folder until I found something I did not remember preserving. It was a yellow legal page scan folded between 2 valuation exhibits. Patrick Reeves had handed the original to me sometime during that last week. His handwriting was compact and slanted, the way it always looked when he was trying to write faster than he thought. Do not sign anything until classification is corrected. That was all. I remembered the moment only after reading the words. Patrick had stopped me near the elevator, carrying a finance binder under one arm. He had asked whether I had signed the redemption acknowledgement yet. I told him I had not. He tore a piece from a legal pad, wrote the sentence, folded it once, and pushed it into my hand. I had been so angry at everyone in that building that I barely registered what he was trying to tell me. Patrick had been Langford's senior finance executive, and one of the first people outside my family who took me seriously when I joined the company full-time. Henry taught me how to read people. Patrick taught me how to read numbers that people hoped I would not question. He was cautious to the point of irritation, but he did not write warnings casually. I photographed the note again, even though I already had the scan, then stared at his name in my phone. We had not spoken in years. I typed 3 different messages and deleted all of them. Anything emotional felt like a mistake. Anything accusatory felt worse. Finally, I wrote, I found something from 2021 with your handwriting on it. I need to know what you remember about my separation classification. I did not send the spreadsheet. I did not mention the amount. I sent the message and put my phone face down. That should have been the moment. I went directly to General Counsel and Andre with everything I had found. Instead, I told myself I needed Patrick's answer first. By the time I left Cedar Bridge that evening, Andre was still in meetings. He texted that he would be home late and asked whether I wanted him to bring dinner. I said yes, then spent the drive from Washington thinking about whether I should tell him as soon as he walked through the door. Every rational part of me knew the answer. I still did not do it. We ate at our kitchen island, a little after 9. Andre had loosened his tie and rolled his sleeves to his forearms. He looked tired, but energized in the way he usually did when a difficult deal had begun to make sense. He told me the acquisitions team liked the economics of the Langford transaction more than they had expected. The company had real assets, strong regional relationships, and a capable workforce. The problem was its balance sheet and the amount of founder control concentrated around Henry. Nothing unusual for a company that grew around one person, Andre said. But it means governance matters. I nearly laughed at the cruelty of that sentence. Andre noticed. What? Nothing. He watched me for another second. Andre had never been easy to lie to, which was one reason I rarely tried. That wasn't nothing. I saw an inconsistency in the historical records today. His expression changed immediately. Not alarm, attention. Related to you? Yes. What kind? I should have told him all of it. Instead, I said, the record says I voluntarily left Langford. Andre put down his fork. You didn't. I know. Does legal know? They know there's a conflict issue. I haven't sent them everything yet. Jessica, I'm still figuring out whether it's actually material. He leaned back slightly. That was one of the things Andre did when he was trying not to react too quickly. You built the rule that says we don't decide materiality alone when we're personally involved. I know the rule. Then why are you deciding it alone? Because it was my father. Because the last time other people got involved, I lost a family, a job, and a future in less than a week. Because I wanted to know whether I was looking at a clerical mistake before I let it become another crisis carrying the Langford name. I did not say any of that. I need another day. Andre did not like it. I could see that. But he also knew the difference between pushing me and warning me. One day doesn't become a week. It won't. That promise lasted less than 48 hours, but the damage had already started the moment I decided I was entitled to make the exception. The next morning, I checked my phone before I got out of bed. Patrick had not responded. At the office, I worked around the Langford matter because my recusal had already begun. The acquisitions team handled the deal. Legal worked on formalizing the conflict protocol. I stayed in operations, which should have made everything easier. Instead, knowing there was a file moving through Cedar Bridge with my father's company name on it made concentration harder than I wanted to admit. At lunch, I reran my equity calculation using a deliberately conservative valuation. The gap remained enormous. That was when I finally sent the documents to General Counsel. I did not send conclusions. I sent the plan, the buyback notice, my 2021 email, my calculation, and Patrick's handwritten note. In the message, I wrote that I believed the historical classification may have affected the redemption value of my management units, and that I wanted compliance to determine what, if anything, Cedar Bridge needed to do with the information. Within 15 minutes, she called me. How long have you had the first email? Since 2021. I mean, how long have you known the Langford record conflicts with it? I looked at the time in the corner of my monitor. 2 days. There was a pause. And the equity issue? Since yesterday. Another pause. Jessica, why didn't you escalate immediately? I wanted to know whether it was real before I turned it into a deal issue. That isn't your call in a conflicted transaction. I knew she was right before she finished saying it. There are moments when being intelligent makes a mistake feel worse because you can see exactly why you made it and exactly why that reason was not good enough. I understand. No, she said, not harshly. You understand now. That distinction matters. She told me not to touch anything else related to the Langford deal until we had a formal review structure. She would notify the appropriate people, including Andre in his capacity as managing partner, without giving him any role in the investment decision. She also wanted a complete chronology of when I discovered each document and what I had done with it. I agreed. Andre called me before I had finished drafting the chronology. His voice was controlled. Legal just briefed me. I know. You knew the equity classification may have cost you more than $1 million and you waited? I found out yesterday. That is not the point. I wanted facts. So did we. That's why we built compliance. The words landed harder because they were true. I stood and walked to the window. Washington was bright outside, traffic moving normally below as if my father's company had not suddenly reached 5 years backward into my life. I wasn't trying to hide it from you. I know that. I didn't want you reacting as my husband before we knew what we had. Andre went quiet. Then he said, "And who gave you the right to decide which version of me got to know?" That stopped me. I had spent years angry at Henry for deciding what information other people could handle. He had decided Amanda needed protection. My mother needed peace. The board did not need the real reason I left. The company did not need an ugly family dispute in its records. Now I had done something smaller, but uncomfortably familiar. I had decided Andre did not need the whole truth until I had organized it for him. "I'm sorry," he exhaled. "I'm not angry that you're looking," he said. "I'm not even angry that this might hurt the deal. I'm angry because this company is ours, and you taught half the people in it that conflicts get disclosed before they become convenient. I know. No exceptions for founders. No exceptions. That was one of our rules. Not because founders were more likely to be dishonest than other people, because founders were more likely to convince themselves their judgment deserved special treatment." Andre softened a little. "What happens now? I give legal everything. I step farther back. They decide what matters. And if they decide this is material, then it gets handled without us bending the process." He nodded, even though I could not see him. I knew the movement from years of conversations. "What do you want this to be?" he asked. I looked at the spreadsheet with the $1 million gap still open on my screen. "I don't know yet." That answer was true. Part of me wanted the money corrected. Part of me wanted the corporate record corrected. Part of me wanted Henry to sit across from someone he respected and be forced to explain why his daughter had supposedly resigned hours after sending an email saying the opposite. And somewhere beneath all of that was the part I did not want to examine. The part that wanted my father to admit he had been wrong. After the call, I sent General Counsel a complete timeline. I included the moment I first saw the voluntary departure language, when I retrieved the email, when I read the equity plan, when I calculated the shortfall, when I contacted Patrick, and when I told Andre. I did not make myself look better. That mattered. By late afternoon, legal had acknowledged receipt and instructed me not to contact anyone else at Langford about the issue until the conflict process was formalized. Patrick was the exception only in the sense that I had already messaged him. I was told not to push further if he did not respond. So, I waited. Patrick finally replied that evening. I was still at my desk when his name appeared on my phone. For a few seconds, I considered not opening the message until I got home. That would have been sensible. I opened it immediately. "Jessica, I remember the note." Another message came before I could type. "I remember the classification." Then a third. I sat absolutely still. "There is more than you knew at the time." I called him, but he declined the call. A minute later, he sent one final message. "Your father was warned." That sentence changed the shape of everything. Until then, I had allowed room for error. An HR shortcut. A badly drafted board record. Someone cleaning up language after an ugly family departure. Even the equity calculation could have come from people relying on the wrong classification without understanding how it had happened. But Patrick was not telling me the record had merely been wrong. He was telling me Henry knew there was a problem. I typed, "Warned about what?" Patrick did not answer. I waited 5 minutes. Then 10. Finally, another message appeared. "Not by text. We need to talk properly." I looked at the $1 million calculation, my father's voluntary departure record, Patrick's old handwritten warning, and the email I had sent the night Henry threw me out. For 5 years, I had believed my father's worst decision was choosing his prejudice over his daughter. I was beginning to understand that it might only have been the first one. By 8 the next morning, I had done something I should have done 2 days earlier. I sent Cedar Bridge's general counsel a complete written chronology of everything I had found, including the parts that made me look bad. I listed the moment I first saw the voluntary departure language, when I pulled the old HR email, when I found the equity plan, when I calculated the shortfall, when I contacted Patrick, and exactly how long I waited before fully disclosing the problem. Then I added one sentence at the bottom that I knew would change my role in the Langford transaction completely. I am requesting formal recusal from all underwriting recommendations, investment committee decisions, negotiation strategy, and access to transaction materials beyond what counsel determines is necessary for factual verification. I did not write it because anyone forced me to. I wrote it because if Henry was eventually going to accuse me of using Cedar Bridge to settle a family score, I wanted the record to show that I had stepped away before he ever had the chance. General counsel called me 20 minutes later and told me the conflict protocol would apply to Andre too. He could remain informed as a managing partner at the level necessary to run the firm, but he would not participate in the investment committee vote, pricing decisions, negotiations with Langford, or any recommendation about whether Cedar Bridge should proceed. Our head of acquisitions, outside transaction counsel, and the independent committee members would control the deal process from that point forward. I remember hanging up and feeling 2 contradictory things at once: relief that the rules were clear, and frustration that I had voluntarily handed the most emotionally important problem of my life to people who did not know my father. Andre was already in his office when I walked in. He had a legal pad in front of him and a mug of coffee he had forgotten to touch, which usually meant he had been thinking instead of working. He waited until I closed the door before saying anything. There was no anger in his face anymore, but there was a distance I recognized, from the rare moments when something between us had become bigger than the first argument about it. Legal sent me the conflict protocol, he said. They were very clear. I nodded and told him I had asked for the full recusal myself. He studied me for a second, then asked, "Are you okay with that, or are you just trying to make sure nobody can accuse you of anything?" "Both," I said, "and I think both are legitimate." I sat across from him and explained what I had been thinking since Patrick's message. If Cedar Bridge walked away from Langford because Andre was furious with Henry, my father would get exactly the story he wanted. He would tell his board that his black son-in-law had waited 5 years to punish him. He would tell lenders and employees that Jessica Langford had used her husband's firm to destroy the company she abandoned. The facts would become background noise, and Henry would once again be the one deciding what version of history everyone heard. "I'm not giving him that," I said. "If this deal dies, it dies because the economics are bad, or because the governance risk is unacceptable, not because you hate my father." Andre looked at me for a long moment. "I do hate what he did to you." I knew the distinction mattered to him, and I also knew he had earned the right to make it. Henry had spent years reducing Andre to race, classifying him before he knew him, and I did not want to do the opposite, by turning Andre into a righteous husband whose only purpose was defending me. Andre was a man with his own professional judgment, his own pride, and his own reasons for refusing to let Henry manipulate the story. "My first instinct was to pull the deal," he admitted, "not to punish him, because I don't like the idea of our investors putting money behind a man who may have manipulated your equity record." I told him I understood, but that was exactly why the independent committee needed to decide. If Henry had done what I suspected, the consequences should come from evidence and governance, not our marriage. Andre leaned back and rubbed his thumb along the edge of the legal pad. "Can I ask you something you're probably going to hate?" I almost smiled because I knew that tone. He used it when he had already decided honesty mattered more than comfort. "Do you still need him to admit he was wrong about you?" he asked. I answered no too quickly, and we both heard it. Andre did not challenge me. He only waited, which was worse. I looked toward the glass wall of his office and watched people moving through the corridor outside, people who knew me as the woman who built systems and made decisions, Not as Henry Langford's rejected daughter. I don't need him back, I said finally. That isn't the same thing as not wanting him to understand what he lost. Andre nodded slowly. That's different. I hated how much relief I felt when he said it. For 5 years, I had treated any remaining pain about my father as evidence that I was weaker than I wanted to be. The truth was simpler and harder. I could love the life I had built with Andre and still grieve the father I thought I had before he made me choose. I could be certain I had married the right man and still hate the price Henry had demanded for it. Those truths did not cancel each other out, and admitting that made me feel less controlled by them. My compliance interview began that afternoon. It was not friendly, which I appreciated more than I expected. The attorney assigned to the review was a woman named Melissa Grant who had worked with Cedar Bridge before but did not report to me. She had my chronology printed in front of her and asked questions in a flat, careful tone that made it obvious she was not interested in protecting my feelings. When did I first see the corporate record? When did I retrieve the HR email? Had I accessed any Langford system? Had I asked anyone at Langford to send me records? Had Andre influenced my decision to investigate? Had I discussed the shortfall with any member of the investment committee? I answered everything, including the fact that I had waited before making full disclosure. Melissa tapped the page with her pen. You understand that your recollection of what happened 5 years ago is not evidence by itself. I told her I did. And your personal email proves what you said, not necessarily what the company understood or what the board approved. I told her I understood that too. She looked at me long enough to make sure I was not simply agreeing to move the interview forward. This process has to survive scrutiny from people who have no reason to trust you, she said. That sentence stayed with me. I had spent years believing that if I could finally collect enough truth would win on its own. Melissa reminded me that facts also needed provenance, context, and a process strong enough to carry them. By the time the interview ended, I felt as if someone had turned me inside out and filed the contents alphabetically. I did not resent it. In fact, for the first time since I saw the voluntary departure entry, I felt safer. Henry had always thrived in rooms where authority depended on who people believed. Cedar Bridge was built to make belief less important than records. The irony was not lost on me that the same system I created was now examining whether I had followed it properly. If I wanted Henry held to rules, I had to accept those rules when they made my life inconvenient too. Patrick agreed to meet me 2 days later. We chose a quiet restaurant just south of Fredericksburg, roughly halfway between Washington and Richmond, because neither of us wanted to meet at Cedar Bridge or Langford. I arrived early and sat at a table near the back with a view of the entrance. When Patrick walked in, I almost did not recognize him at first. 5 years had added more gray to his hair and carved deeper lines around his mouth, but he still carried himself the same way. Shoulders slightly forward as though he was always leaning toward a spreadsheet nobody else could see. He stopped beside the table and looked at me for a moment before sitting down. You look well, he said. I told him he did too, even though neither of us was there to discuss how time had treated us. A server brought water. Patrick waited until she walked away, then placed his hands flat on the table and said, I should have called you years ago. I did not tell him it was fine, because it was not. I asked him what he meant when he said my father had been warned. Patrick looked toward the window before answering. Your separation classification was challenged internally. His language was careful, the kind of language finance executives use when they are trying not to stray into legal conclusions. He told me the first valuation work he saw after I left had treated the departure as a termination, which meant the equity redemption should have been calculated under the more favorable formula. Then, the classification changed. By the time the final package circulated, the record described me as voluntarily leaving. Patrick objected. He said the language did not match what he understood had happened, and he was concerned the economics were being changed by a classification nobody had properly documented. Who changed it? I asked. I don't know who typed the words into the final record. He met my eyes. But I know Henry knew there was a problem. That distinction frustrated me. I wanted a name, a date, an instruction, something clean. Patrick could see it. Jessica, I'm not going to tell you something I can't prove just because it would make the story easier. I saw the initial valuation. I raised the issue. Counsel was involved. Your father knew the classification was being questioned. He paused. That's what I know firsthand. I asked whether he had emails. Patrick shook his head before I finished. Not that I can hand you. He explained that some of what he remembered involved company counsel and communications that were not his to disclose. He still worked for Langford, and even if he had copies, privilege and company confidentiality mattered. Oddly, that answer made me trust him more. A man trying to make himself a hero would have slid a folder across the table. Patrick did not. He told me that if the matter became a formal board investigation, independent directors and their counsel could request archived finance material and review the company's own legal records through the proper process. Is there an archive? I asked. There was. He described a finance binder used during the 2021 year-end process. It would have contained valuation worksheets, board materials, and documentation around management equity changes. He did not know whether it was still retained. Langford had migrated several systems since then, and some electronic files had been reorganized. If the old binder still exists, it may help establish the sequence, he said. But you cannot ask me to pull it for you. I wasn't going to. He gave me a look that suggested 5 years earlier I might have. He was probably right. I asked him why he had stayed silent. That was the question I had wanted to ask more than any question about the numbers, and I hated that admitting it made me sound like the daughter I had spent years pretending not to be. Patrick looked down at his hands. Because I was afraid of losing my job, he said. There was no noble story in the first answer, and I respected him for not inventing one. Then he added that Langford employed hundreds of people, that Henry had been making increasingly aggressive decisions, and that Patrick had convinced himself remaining inside the company gave him a chance to limit the damage. He had a mortgage, children approaching college, and a career tied closely to Langford. He told himself that leaving in protest would accomplish nothing. Did staying accomplish something? I asked. He flinched slightly. That's not fair, he said. No, it isn't. Neither was what happened to me. He nodded, accepting it. I know. I did not want Patrick destroyed. That surprised me. On the drive there, I had imagined being much angrier. Sitting across from him, I saw a man who had failed me without ever deciding he wanted to hurt me. That did not absolve him. Cowardice could do enormous damage even when it wore the face of caution. What you're telling me now matters, I said. It doesn't erase what you didn't do then. Patrick looked relieved and ashamed at the same time. I'm not asking it to, he said. Before we left, Patrick gave me one piece of information I could use without crossing any line. He told me the original finance package had been assembled during a board reporting cycle and would likely have been preserved under Langford's records retention schedule. If Cedar Bridge's diligence raised a material governance question, the proper request should come through counsel. He also said that counsel communications from the time would have to be handled by Langford's board or an independent committee, not by me. I thanked him for being precise. He told me precision was the least he owed me. I reported the meeting to General Counsel as soon as I returned to Washington. I did not summarize Patrick's emotions, only the facts. Original valuation may have treated the separation as termination. Patrick raised a classification concern. Henry was aware of the concern. Finance archive and board materials may exist. Potential attorney communications must be obtained only through an appropriate Langford process. Our lawyers documented it, then told me not to pursue Patrick further unless they approved the contact. For the next several days, I stayed away from the Langford deal. I had plenty of other work, but avoiding one file inside your own company is harder than it sounds when that file concerns the family that taught you how to recognize silence as a weapon. I knew the acquisitions team continued underwriting the transaction. I knew Langford's assets were still attractive. I knew the conflict screen meant Andre was not sitting in those meetings either. That was all I was supposed to know. And for once, I respected the boundary without trying to outsmart it. What I did not know was that Henry had finally been told why the conflict screen existed. I learned that when my phone rang at 6:17 on a Thursday evening, the name on the screen made me stare at it until the third ring. Dad. I had never deleted his number. I had simply stopped expecting it to appear. I answered, because I was not going to spend the next hour wondering what he wanted. Hello? For a second, neither of us spoke. 5 years collapsed into the silence between us. Then Henry said, "What are you doing to my company?" No hello, no question about my life, no acknowledgement that the last time we spoke as father and daughter, he had told me I was no longer welcome in his home. Apparently 5 years was enough time for everything, except manners. "I'm not doing anything to your company. Don't play games with me, Jessica." "I'm not." He said Cedar Bridge's lawyers had informed Langford that a formal conflict protocol was in place because of family relationships involving senior personnel. He knew I was Cedar Bridge's COO. He knew Andre was a managing partner. He knew both of us had been screened from the investment decision. Somehow, even that offended him. "You expect me to believe you're sitting there while my company is being examined and you have nothing to do with it?" I disclosed the conflict before I knew there was a historical issue. There was a pause. "What historical issue?" I almost answered. Then Melissa's voice came back to me. Facts had to survive people who had no reason to trust me. Henry was not entitled to a private preview of an investigation simply because he was my father. "You'll receive anything material through the proper process." His laugh was short and humorless. "Proper process. You always did love that phrase." "No. I loved processes people couldn't change after the fact." That silenced him for a beat. When he spoke again, his tone had cooled. "I know what this is." "What is it?" "You've spent 5 years waiting for a chance to prove something." I looked around my office. Through the glass, most of the floor had emptied. Cedar Bridge had not existed when Henry threw me out. The desks, systems, employees, investment committees, and policies around me were part of a life he had not believed I could build without him. "You think I spent 5 years waiting for you?" I asked. "I think resentment makes people patient." There it was, Henry's favorite trick. If I objected to what he had done, the objection became proof that I was emotional. If I stayed silent, the silence became proof that he had done nothing wrong. "I'm recused from the investment decision," I said. "So is Andre." "Convenient. It's documented. Everything with you is documented." I almost smiled. "Yes," I said. "That may become important." His breathing changed slightly. It was the only sign I had landed anywhere near the truth. Then Henry said the thing he had clearly called to say. "If you turn this into a personal vendetta and damage Langford, I will make sure the board, the lenders, and everyone involved in this deal understands exactly what happened. I will not let you use your husband's position to punish me." I stood behind my desk and looked down at the city lights beginning to come on below. 5 years earlier, that threat would have terrified me because Henry controlled the company, the family, the money, and the story. Now he controlled only some of those things. And for the first time, I understood that he had not realized the difference. "If this deal fails because the numbers are bad, that isn't me," I said. "If it fails because the governance is bad, that isn't me either. And if someone finds something in your records that you don't want found, I suggest you stop worrying about what story I'll tell and start worrying about what the documents say." He went silent. Then he said, very quietly, "Be careful, Jessica." I had heard that warning from him when I was 22 and challenging a vendor he liked, when I was 28 and questioning an acquisition he wanted, and when I was 34 and refusing to let him choose my husband. For years, "Be careful" had meant remember who has the power. This time, it sounded different. "I am," I told him. "That's why I'm not the one deciding whether you stay." He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood there, with the phone still in my hand, listening to the deadline. I did not know yet what the independent review would find. I did not know whether Patrick's memory could be corroborated, whether the old finance records still existed, or whether the classification would ultimately be treated as an ugly administrative error instead of something deliberate. But I knew one thing for certain. My father was already afraid of a process I no longer controlled, and that meant there was something inside it he did not want anyone else to see. The formal complaint from Langford arrived the following Monday morning, and for all the accusations my father had thrown at me over the phone, the letter was written in the careful language of people who expected other lawyers to read every word. It did not accuse me of fabricating documents, It did not say I had interfered with the investment committee because there was no evidence I had. Instead, Langford's counsel argued that Cedar Bridge's existing conflict protocol was insufficient because of my direct financial and personal interest in historical employment and equity matters involving the target company. The letter requested that I be removed not only from the investment decision, which had already happened, but from any access to Langford-related diligence, document review, internal commentary, or communications that might indirectly influence the transaction. It also suggested that my prior departure from Langford had been contentious and raised the possibility that I had a motive to damage the company. The phrase was so polished that I almost admired it. Henry had managed to turn the fact that he fired me for marrying Andre into a reason nobody should trust me when I objected to how that firing had been recorded. General Counsel forwarded the letter to me with a short note telling me not to respond. I did not need the instruction. Every instinct I had once relied on at Langford told me to dismantle the argument line by line, but that was exactly what I could no longer do. I had asked for rules that would outlive personal loyalties, and now those rules required me to stand still while my father used formal channels to paint me as unstable. I read the letter twice, then closed it. The second time, I noticed something that bothered me more than the accusation itself. Henry's lawyers repeatedly described me as having left the company in 2021, following a family disagreement. They did not use the words voluntary resignation, but they also did not say I had been terminated. The language floated between the two realities, vague enough to protect whichever version became more useful later. By then, the transaction team had begun requesting non-privileged historical records from Langford because the equity discrepancy was no longer something Cedar Bridge could simply ignore. I could not see the live diligence room anymore, but General Counsel was allowed to give me factual updates that related directly to my own former employment and ownership. She told me they had located an old valuation working paper prepared around the time of my departure. The document treated my separation as a termination for purposes of management equity valuation. They had also found an early board reporting draft that did not describe me as voluntarily leaving. The final corporate history, however, did. That was useful, but not conclusive. She made that point twice. Drafts change. Boards approve different language. People correct mistakes. The existence of an earlier version did not prove Henry had ordered anyone to falsify a record. I understood. I did not like it, but I understood. The distinction mattered because anger wanted the cleanest possible story. Henry fired me, then changed the record, then paid me less. Cause, effect, guilt. Real evidence was messier. The original valuation supported my memory. My email supported my memory. The buyback math showed an economic consequence. Patrick had confirmed that he raised the classification issue. None of those things yet proved who directed the final wording, or whether the change had been made deliberately to reduce my redemption amount. I had spent enough time in operations to know the danger of deciding what happened first and then forcing every document to fit. If I expected investigators to resist Henry's version of events, I had to resist inventing my own. My mother called that afternoon. Unlike my father, Constance had texted first. She asked whether I had 10 minutes. I almost replied that she had had 5 years, but that would have been satisfying for about 15 seconds and useful for none. I told her I could talk after work. She called exactly at 6:30, which was typical of my mother. Even emotional ambushes arrived on schedule. "Jessica," she said, and there was so much caution in my name that I knew Henry had already briefed her. "I don't want to fight." "Then don't," she sighed. "Can we not start like this?" I leaned back in my chair. I was still at Cedar Bridge because I had not felt like carrying the conversation home to Andre. "You called me." "I know. I'm trying to stop this before it becomes something none of us can undo." That sounded almost reasonable until I asked what, exactly, she believed I was doing. "Your father says Cedar Bridge is going through old employment records and trying to turn a separation issue into a governance investigation. My father knows more about why those records are being reviewed than I do right now." "Jessica." "No, Mom. I'm serious. I'm screened from the deal. That doesn't mean you have no influence." There it was, softer than Henry, as always, but built on the same foundation. Andre and I had created a system specifically designed to prevent our influence from deciding the outcome, and my mother's answer was that our very existence made the system suspect. "What would make you comfortable?" I asked. "If Cedar Bridge stopped looking? I would be comfortable if everyone remembered that a company employs hundreds of people who had nothing to do with what happened between you and your father." I closed my eyes briefly. I remember that better than he does. I'm not asking Cedar Bridge to kill the deal. Then why keep digging? Because the company record says I resigned when I didn't, and that classification affected what I was paid. Silence. Not surprise. Silence. I sat up straighter. "Did you know that?" I knew there had been disagreement about how everything was handled. "That isn't what I asked." "Your father was trying to keep a very ugly family situation from spilling into the company." I laughed once, not because anything was funny. "By writing me out of it? Please don't use words like that." "What words would you prefer?" She went quiet again. Then came the sentence I had heard from her in 100 different forms since childhood. "Your father is almost 70 years old." I waited. "This company is his entire life," she continued. "You know what he built. You know what it took. If this transaction falls apart because of something from 5 years ago, it won't only hurt him." "I know." "Then be the bigger person." I looked through the glass wall of my office at the empty desks beyond it. That phrase had once had extraordinary power over me. Be the bigger person meant ignore the insult at dinner. Let Amanda have the opportunity, because she needed confidence. Don't challenge Dad in front of other executives. Don't make Mom choose sides. Don't ruin Christmas. Don't force people to confront what they had done if silence kept everyone more comfortable. "I am being the bigger person," I said. I disclosed the conflict. I stepped away from the vote. I'm not leaking anything. I'm not calling reporters. I'm letting independent people look at documents. What you're asking is not for me to be bigger. You're asking me to make myself smaller so Dad doesn't have to answer questions. That's unfair. Is it? You make him sound like some kind of criminal. I haven't called him a criminal once. Maybe not in those words. The defensiveness in her voice told me something important. Henry had not merely told her there was a paperwork dispute. He had told her enough to make her afraid of what might be found. I asked one more question. Did Dad fire me because I married Andre? Jessica, we've been over this. No, we've spent 5 years avoiding it. Did he fire me because I married Andre? He believed you were making a choice that would permanently divide the family. That wasn't the question. My mother's breath caught softly through the phone. He believed Andre was not the right fit for our family. There it was again. Fit, background, tradition. All the words people use when the real word is too ugly to say aloud. And when I chose him anyway, I said, Dad fired me. You chose to walk away. My hand tightened around the phone. I told him I was not resigning. I know you said that. The room went still around me. Not I didn't know. I know you said that. I had been angry with my mother many times. This was different. Anger is hot. What I felt then was cold and clarifying. How long have you known? Known what? That I didn't resign. That isn't what I said. It's exactly what you said. She began talking quickly then, telling me that families remember conversations differently, that Henry had viewed my decision to marry Andre and leave his authority as one choice, that everyone had been emotional, that paperwork completed during a family crisis did not necessarily reflect anyone's intent. She kept adding words because she knew she had given me something she could not take back. I did not press harder. Not yet. I was not recording the call, and I had no intention of turning my mother into a secret witness by tricking her into saying more. But I stored the conversation carefully in my memory and wrote a factual note afterward for my own timeline. Constance acknowledged, knowing I had stated I was not resigning. Nothing more. No embellished conclusion. Before we ended the call, she tried once more. Whatever happened, your father made one bad decision during an emotional period. That may be what you need to believe. What do you mean by that? I mean, one decision happened in his office. Everything after that had its own date. She did not answer. The next major discovery came 2 days later through counsel. The transaction team had completed a deeper review of the non-privileged historical materials they were allowed to request at that stage. The old valuation working paper was authentic and tied to the 2021 reporting cycle. It listed my management units and applied the termination formula. The early board draft also treated my departure as an involuntary separation. Somewhere between those documents and the final ownership record, the language changed. The economic treatment changed with it. General counsel repeated the caution I already knew. This establishes inconsistency. It does not establish who caused it. I know. There's also a document retention problem. That got my attention. Langford had migrated financial and document management systems several years after I left. The transaction team had expected to recover metadata showing who edited certain records, when, and from which internal account. Some of that metadata no longer existed in the active system. The migration had been performed as part of a normal technology upgrade, and there was no evidence anyone had destroyed records to hide my case. It was simply an old trail that had become incomplete. For several seconds, I stared at the wall opposite my desk and felt the first real drop in confidence since the investigation started. Henry did not need to prove the classification was correct. If nobody could prove who changed it or why, he could call the whole thing clerical confusion, a messy departure, an HR shorthand, a finance assumption. My email could get the corporate record corrected. The valuation documents might justify a revised payment. But the larger question whether Henry knowingly manipulated the record and then allowed the false version to survive could remain permanently out of reach. "Does that end it?" I asked. "No," General Counsel said, "but it changes what evidence matters." That was a lawyer's answer, which meant both less and more than I wanted. The same afternoon, Amanda texted me. I had not heard from my sister in nearly a year. Our relationship after 2021 had never completely disappeared, but it had reduced itself to birthday texts, occasional condolences, and the kind of careful exchanges people use when both know the real subject is too dangerous. Her message said she was in Washington for a client meeting and wanted to talk before she drove back to Richmond. I showed the text to General Counsel before replying. "Personal conversation is your choice," she said. "Do not ask her for confidential company records. Do not discuss Cedar Bridge's underwriting. If she volunteers information, document it afterward." Those restrictions did not bother me. I did not want Langford's confidential files from Amanda. I wanted to know why my sister had spent 5 years acting as if I had simply walked away. We met at a coffee shop, several blocks from Cedar Bridge. Amanda arrived in a cream jacket and low heels, looking exactly like the public version of a Langford executive my father would have wanted. She had inherited Constance's polished restraint and Henry's habit of entering a room as though it had been waiting for her. 5 years earlier, I might have looked at that and thought she was pretending. By then, I understood something I had not understood when we were younger. People could grow into the roles they were given, even when those roles had begun as someone else's consolation prize. She did not order anything. "You look good," she said after sitting down. "So do you." "This is weird." "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. "Dad thinks you're trying to destroy him." "I'm sure he does. He says you found some old paperwork and turned it into a deal issue." The transaction team found an ownership discrepancy. I confirmed the record about me was wrong. Amanda's jaw tightened. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Say something in the most technically correct way possible, so nobody can argue with you." I almost smiled. Usually I do it because I don't want to lie. She looked away. That was when I knew. Not what she knew, not yet, but that there was something. "Did you ever believe I resigned?" I asked. Her eyes came back to mine. "Why does that matter now?" "Because Dad's company says I did." "You left." "I was fired." "You knew what would happen if you married Andre." The sentence hurt more coming from her than from Henry, partly because Amanda had never said anything that direct to me before. "So that makes it a resignation?" "That's not what I meant." "Then tell me what you meant." She crossed her arms. "You made a choice. I married my husband, and Dad made his." "Yes. He fired me, which is exactly what I'm asking about." Amanda looked around the coffee shop, even though nobody was paying attention to us. "I didn't know what the paperwork said when it happened." That answer was specific enough to leave a door open. What about later? She did not respond. Amanda. About a year later, I heard Mom and Dad arguing about it. About what? About whether you actually resigned. My pulse climbed, but I kept my voice level. And what did they say? I'm not giving you some courtroom testimony, Jess. I didn't ask for one. You know how Dad talks. He said you chose Andre over the company, so as far as he was concerned, you left. As far as he was concerned isn't a legal classification. Her expression hardened. That's why talking to you is exhausting. I almost fired back, then stopped myself. I remembered us as children, Amanda sitting on the floor outside my bedroom while I studied, asking if she could borrow my clothes, asking what classes she should take, asking how I always knew what Dad wanted. By the time I joined Langford full-time, Henry had already started comparing us in ways neither of us asked for. Jessica understood the numbers. Jessica could handle operations. Jessica was the one you gave hard problems to. Amanda was good with people, good with clients, polished and quick, but Henry treated those strengths as decorative beside mine. I had participated in that hierarchy more than I liked admitting. When Amanda once asked if she could move from marketing into project operations, I told her she would hate it. I thought I was saving her from a role that did not fit her. Looking back, I could hear how much I sounded like Henry deciding what kind of person someone else was allowed to become. I know Dad compared us, I said. Amanda laughed without humor. That's one way to say it. I also know I didn't always make that easier. That surprised her. I continued before I could retreat from the admission. I thought I knew what you were good at. Sometimes I treated that like I knew what you could become. I was wrong to do that. For a moment, Amanda looked almost young enough to be the girl who used to follow me around our parents' house. Then the expression vanished. When you left, she said, he needed me. There it was. Not money. Not ambition in the abstract. Need. Before that, every meeting was, Jessica said this. Jessica built that. Jessica caught this problem. Jessica should look at that contract. Then suddenly you were gone, and Dad came to me. He asked me to sit in on executive meetings. He wanted my opinion. Do you know what that felt like? Yes. No, you don't. I let her have that. She leaned closer. You had Andre. You had your new company. You had somewhere else to go. I had spent my whole life being second in that family, and for once, I wasn't. So, when you learned I hadn't resigned, you stayed quiet. Her face changed. I didn't know the details. That isn't what I said. I knew there had been an argument about the classification. I knew Mom thought Dad should fix something. I did not know about your payout. Did you ask? No. Why? She gave me a look full of anger and shame. Because I knew what asking might cost me. That was the most honest thing she had said. I sat back. Amanda expected me to attack. I could see it. She was prepared to defend herself against the older sister, who would tell her she had failed some moral test. What I felt instead was an ugly kind of understanding. She had been handed the thing she wanted most at exactly the moment. Telling the truth might have taken it away. Understanding was not forgiveness. You were afraid Dad would decide he needed me again, I said. She looked down. That doesn't make what you did okay. I know. Do you? Her eyes lifted. What do you want me to say? That I should have blown up my career because Dad treated you badly? No. I want you to stop describing my career as something I abandoned so yours could begin. The words hit. Amanda's mouth tightened. I earned what I have. I didn't say you didn't. You think it. I think you earned some of it. I also think Dad cleared the road in front of you, after throwing me off it. Both things can be true. She stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. A few people looked over. She lowered her voice. This is exactly why Dad is afraid of you being involved in the deal. I'm not involved in the decision. That doesn't mean you aren't doing damage. I stood too, but I did not follow when she picked up her purse. Amanda, the damage happened before Cedar Bridge ever saw the company. She looked at me for a long second, then walked out. I sat back down after she left and wrote everything I could remember about the conversation into a factual memo for my attorney and compliance file. I distinguished what Amanda said directly from what I inferred. She had not confessed to altering records. She had not admitted knowledge of the equity shortfall. What she had said was enough to establish something narrower. Within roughly a year of my departure, she knew there was a dispute over whether I had actually resigned, and she chose not to ask questions because her new position benefited from my absence. That was morally ugly. It was not yet corporate misconduct. I understood the difference. The next morning, that distinction became painfully relevant when Cedar Bridge opened a formal internal review of my own conduct. General Counsel asked me to come to a conference room at 9. Melissa was already there. So was another compliance attorney I knew only slightly. Nobody looked alarmed, which somehow made me more nervous. Melissa slid a single-page notice across the table. Langford's formal complaint, combined with the expanding historical issue, meant Cedar Bridge needed to document that I had not improperly influenced the transaction. Until the review was complete, my access restrictions would be broadened. I was already recused from underwriting, committee deliberations, negotiations, and strategy. Now I would also be removed from every Langford-related folder and internal system, including factual diligence materials that I might otherwise have been permitted to review as the former executive involved. I read the notice carefully. Am I being investigated for misconduct? We're reviewing whether any of your actions created an undisclosed influence or information problem, Melissa said. Because I waited 2 days. That's part of it. And because Henry complained. That made documenting the issue more important. I nodded. The rational part of me understood everything they were doing. The rest of me hated it. I had built large pieces of the compliance architecture they were now using to lock me out of a transaction involving my own father and my own money. There was almost something perversely elegant about it. What happens to my other responsibilities? Nothing changes unless the review gives us a reason. So I'm not suspended from Cedar Bridge. No, just from anything Langford. Yes. I signed the acknowledgement. Melissa watched me put the pen down. You can disagree with the process. I don't. You look like you do. I dislike being on this side of it. That's different. I gave her a tired smile. Apparently, I'm learning a lot about distinctions lately. When I returned to my office, every Langford-related workspace had disappeared from my permissions. There was no dramatic warning screen, no red banner. The folders simply were not there anymore. I stood in front of my desk and felt something I had not expected. Powerless. Not in the way I had felt 5 years earlier when Henry fired me. This was not arbitrary. Nobody was punishing me for whom I married. The people restricting me had rules, reasons, documentation, and a process I had agreed to. That did not make the feeling pleasant. For the first time since this started, I had to accept that the next major discovery might happen without me. I could no longer see what Langford produced. I could not follow the diligence trail. I could not ask Patrick to retrieve anything. I could not even know whether Henry's lawyers were winning the argument unless counsel decided the information directly concerned me. I had wanted the truth separated from my personal power. Now it was. And all I could do was wait to find out whether the system I trusted would still reach the same conclusion once I was no longer allowed to help it get there. 3 days after Cedar Bridge locked me out of every Langford-related system, Melissa called me back into the same conference room where I had signed the expanded restriction notice. I had spent those 3 days doing everything I was supposed to do. I reviewed unrelated portfolio operations, sat through 2 vendor risk meetings, approved a technology contract, and refused to ask Andre for updates about the Langford transaction. It was harder than I expected. Not because I thought the process would collapse without me, but because there is a particular kind of helplessness in knowing strangers are examining the worst decision your father ever made, while you are required to pretend your calendar is normal. Melissa had a folder in front of her when I sat down. General Counsel joined us by video, and neither woman looked like she was about to tell me I had committed some hidden catastrophe. The internal review is complete, Melissa said. She walked me through the findings slowly. I had used only documents that belonged to me, or that I had lawful access to. I had not contacted anyone at Langford for confidential records. I had not influenced the acquisitions team, pricing, underwriting, or investment committee. I had not asked Andre to intervene. My formal recusal had been appropriate and timely once the full scope of the conflict became clear. The only criticism was the one I had already earned. I should have escalated the inconsistency the moment I realized the corporate record and my personal email conflicted, instead of spending 2 days trying to determine materiality on my own. That was a lapse in judgment, Melissa said, not misconduct. I nodded. I could have defended myself by saying 2 days had not changed the transaction. I could have said I had been trying to avoid overreacting to a family issue. Both statements were true, and neither changed the fact that I had made an exception for myself inside a system I expected everyone else to follow. I agree, I said. We should change the related party procedure so the person identifying the issue doesn't decide whether it's material before escalation. General Counsel glanced up from her notes. You already have a proposal? I had 3 days with nothing Langford related to look at. That got a small smile out of Melissa. By the following afternoon, I had drafted a change requiring any senior executive who discovered a personal, family, or financial connection to an active transaction to disclose the underlying fact within 24 hours. Even if they believed the issue was immaterial, compliance, not the conflicted executive, would determine what happened next. It was not a dramatic reform. Nobody applauded. Most good controls are boring enough that people only notice them when they fail. But making the change mattered to me because I did not want my mistake reduced to a lesson I claimed to have learned. I wanted it built into the company after me. My general access returned immediately. The Langford restrictions did not. I remained completely outside that transaction, which meant being cleared did not give me the satisfaction of seeing what the diligence team had found while I was under review. I asked no questions. I was not entitled to ask. I did not look over anyone's shoulder or use my authority as COO to request reports that happened to mention Langford. If I was going to insist that my father be judged by rules instead of relationships, I could not spend the next few weeks searching for ways around the rules because they inconvenienced me. Andre came into my office near the end of that day and shut the door behind him. Melissa told me you were cleared, he said. She also told you I got dinged for delayed disclosure. She did. I'm glad. He gave me a look. You're glad you got criticized? I'm glad they didn't pretend it was fine, because I'm a founder. Andre leaned against the edge of my desk. You know most people would take the win and stop there. Most people didn't write the policy I violated. He nodded, and the tension that had been sitting between us since the Langford name first appeared finally loosened. We did not need some sweeping marital reconciliation because our marriage had never been the thing breaking. We had disagreed about how I handled information. I had been wrong. I corrected it. Andre had been angry and still trusted me. There was something reassuring about a conflict that did not need betrayal, shouting, or a grand gesture to matter. That evening, he asked whether I wanted to drive instead of going straight home. We ended up taking the longer route out of Washington, past the blocks where Cedar Bridge had once rented 2 rooms from a consulting firm whose receptionist answered both companies' phones. Andre pointed toward the building as we passed. Remember when we thought that place was expensive? It was expensive. We had 6 employees. We had 4 employees and 2 people we were pretending we could afford. He laughed. I did too, but seeing that building brought back a version of us I had not thought about in a long time. When people looked at Cedar Bridge in 2026, they saw institutional investors, professional offices, a real investment committee, compliance staff, outside counsel, and almost $900 million in committed capital across funds and mandates. They did not see the first year. When Andre and I argued over whether we could afford another analyst before we had signed the next investor, they did not see me negotiating software contracts line by line because every recurring expense felt personal. They did not see Andre taking calls from potential investors in our spare bedroom while I built the first vendor risk matrix at the dining table. Andre had not started with nothing. I have always hated stories that pretend competence appears from pure suffering. He had a strong career in infrastructure finance, a reputation, relationships, and enough credibility that serious people took his calls. I had nearly a decade of operations experience and a financial cushion from the Langford buyback, even if that buyback now looked painfully incomplete. We were privileged compared with many people who tried to build businesses. We were also taking a real risk. Andre left a secure role with a salary most people would have considered extraordinary. I walked away from the only professional world I had known. We had capital, but not enough to waste. We had relationships, but no guarantee those relationships would become commitments. The first version of Cedar Bridge was built from the exact differences between us that made the partnership work. Andre could sit across from an institutional investor and explain why an infrastructure platform would create value over 10 years. I could walk into the same opportunity and tell him which controls would collapse in 10 months if nobody fixed them. He saw financing structures. I saw operating dependencies. He liked momentum. I liked evidence. We argued often, but our arguments usually made the company better, because neither of us needed the other to become a weaker version of ourselves. I remember one night, during that first year, when we were sitting on the floor of our apartment with takeout containers between us, because we had not bought a proper dining table yet. Andre was reviewing an investor deck, and I was designing the first approval matrix for portfolio expenses. He looked over at my laptop and asked why a small firm with 6 people needed a written conflict protocol. Because one day we might have 60, I said. He told me 60 sounded optimistic. I said 600 sounded better, and he threw a napkin at me. That protocol eventually became part of the structure, now keeping both of us away from my father's transaction. The irony would have been funny if the stakes were not so personal. When we started Cedar Bridge, I also made another choice I rarely talked about. We delayed buying a home. We could have afforded one, especially after my Langford equity payout and Andre's savings, but neither of us wanted to pull too much cash away from the business while it was fragile. We rented longer. Andre took a lower salary than he could have earned elsewhere. I did the same. We did not suffer heroically. We still ate well, traveled occasionally, and lived comfortably. But we made choices. We put money into a company, instead of into the life people around us assumed we should already be living. That was why the equity shortfall bothered me differently once I understood it. If my classification had been correct, the additional money would not have transformed our lives. It would not have made Cedar Bridge inevitable, but it would have bought us time. It might have allowed us to hire sooner. It might have reduced some of the risk we carried personally. Henry's decision had not only rewritten the story of why I left, it had quietly changed the resources I carried with me when I built what came next. Andre must have been thinking about the same years, because when we reached a red light, he said, "Can I ask you something without you answering like a COO? That sounds dangerous." "I'm serious." "So am I." He looked through the windshield for a moment before speaking. "Do you ever wish you had chosen differently?" The question was simple enough that I almost misunderstood it. About Cedar Bridge? About me. The light changed, but I did not move until the car behind us gave a short, impatient tap of the horn. I drove through the intersection and waited until we were on a quieter street before answering. "No." Andre looked at me. "I mean it," I said. "I have never wished I didn't marry you. I know you love me." "That isn't what you asked." He was quiet. I understood then why he was asking. For 5 years, Andre had carried a piece of my family's rejection that I had never asked him to carry. He knew intellectually that Henry's prejudice belonged to Henry. He also knew the sequence of events. Jessica chooses Andre, Jessica loses her father, Jessica loses her job, Jessica gets cut off from the family she expected to inherit. Cause and blame are not the same thing, but people can feel guilt even when they know better. "I wish Dad had been different," I said. "I wish my mother had stood up. I wish Amanda had said something. I wish I hadn't had to choose at all. But I don't wish I chose someone else." Andre stared out the passenger window. "I hate that it cost you so much," he said. "That's not the same as you costing me something." He looked back at me. "Henry made the price," I said. "You didn't." I had never put it that way before, and I saw the sentence settle somewhere in him. It did something to me too. For years I had been careful not to talk too much about what I lost because I did not want Andre to hear regret where there was none. My silence had probably created more room for his fear, not less. Then he asked, If he apologized tomorrow, really apologized, would you want him back? I tightened my hands on the steering wheel. That's unfair. You asked Patrick unfair questions. I'm not married to Patrick. That's why I'm allowed to ask better ones. I smiled despite myself, then let the question sit. I don't know, I admitted. I think part of me still wants him to say he was wrong. I'm not sure that means I want the relationship back. Andre nodded. That makes sense. I hate that it makes sense. Most true things are inconvenient. I glanced at him. Did you steal that from me? Probably. We drove the rest of the way home without returning to Henry. The conversation did not solve my family. It did something more useful. It separated two desires I had been treating as one. I wanted the truth acknowledged. I was no longer sure I wanted the man who had denied it, restored to the center of my life. The next morning, still unable to access anything related to the active Langford transaction, I returned to the old personal archive for a different reason. Compliance had told me I could continue organizing my own historical records as long as I did not contact Langford or attempt to access company information. I was checking whether I had preserved any final performance reviews or project reports that might become relevant if the separation itself were challenged. That was when I found a memo I had written about 6 weeks before Henry fired me. The title was dry enough that I almost skipped it. Expansion Financing Risk, Regional Acquisition Strategy. I remembered the argument immediately. In early 2021, Henry wanted Langford to accelerate expansion by using debt to buy a smaller contractor in the Carolinas, and then pursue additional development projects before the integration was complete. I had not opposed growth. I opposed the sequence. My memo argued that Langford's working capital and bonding capacity could become strained if multiple large projects hit delays at the same time. I recommended slower integration, stricter leverage thresholds, and a staged acquisition approach. Henry had hated it. You always find the brakes, he told me. I find them because you keep driving toward walls. That exchange had become family legend for about a month, with Henry retelling it at dinner as proof that his older daughter had inherited his stubbornness. At the time, it had almost felt affectionate. I read the memo again in 2026 and felt no triumphant sense that I had predicted the future. I had not predicted anything magical. Langford survived. It grew. Henry made money. Some of the deals I worried about probably worked exactly as he hoped. But the company now needed a strategic recapitalization, partly because leverage had become restrictive, and a planned regional acquisition required stronger capital support. The kind of pressure I had warned about was not imaginary. I sent the memo to my personal attorney for preservation, then notified Cedar Bridge's general counsel that I had found it. I explicitly said I did not believe it was evidence of wrongdoing and was not submitting it as part of the transaction review unless counsel believed it was relevant. She agreed. The memo did not prove Henry had committed anything improper. It showed only that I had been analyzing the same class of financial risk years earlier. That distinction protected me from turning competence into prophecy. Still, emotionally, the memo mattered. Henry had not merely lost a daughter because he could not accept the man she loved. He had removed an executive who sometimes saw problems differently from him, precisely because he disliked being challenged. I had spent years wondering whether I had overstated my own importance at Langford because being fired had wounded my pride. The memo reminded me that I had not been valuable because I was Henry's chosen heir. I had been valuable because I did the work. 2 days later, General Counsel asked me to meet again. The news was not what I wanted. The transaction team had reached a dead end on the digital trail. Langford had migrated several financial and document management systems in 2023. The migration itself appeared routine. Records were transferred, archived, or superseded under retention policies. Some edit history and metadata from older systems had not survived in a useful form. There was no evidence anyone had destroyed metadata because of my separation. It was simply one of those things companies did during technology changes, without imagining that 5 years later, someone might need to know which account changed 3 words in a 2021 record. So, we can't identify who changed the language, I said. Not from the available system data. Can we identify when? Broadly. Not with enough precision to establish intent. I looked down at the conference table. What does that mean for the investigation? It means the current evidence supports that the records are inconsistent and that your economic treatment may need correction. It does not yet establish deliberate concealment by Henry. That was the first time since Patrick's message that I felt the story slipping away from me. Not the money. That could still be recalculated. Not even the corporate record. My email was strong enough that voluntary departure was difficult to defend indefinitely. What seemed to be disappearing was the part that mattered most to me, proof that Henry had known. Patrick's memory mattered, but memory 5 years later was still memory. An old valuation sheet mattered, but numbers changed for legitimate reasons. An early board draft mattered, but drafts were not final corporate acts. Even my mother's admission that she knew I said I was not resigning did not prove Henry intentionally preserved a false classification for financial or governance reasons. For the first time, I seriously considered whether this would end with a technical correction and a settlement nobody outside a small group of lawyers ever understood. I hated how disappointing that felt. That reaction embarrassed me enough that I said it aloud to Andre that night. I think I wanted more. He closed the book he had been pretending to read on the couch. More money? No. More proof? Yes. Or more punishment? I looked at him. Maybe both. He nodded instead of trying to make me feel better. I want him to have known, I said, then immediately heard how terrible it sounded. Andre frowned. No, you don't. I know. I mean, I want proof that what Patrick said is true. I don't want Dad to have done something worse. I want the thing he already did to be visible. That's different. I'm getting tired of that phrase. Still true. I leaned my head back against the couch. What if we never know? Andre thought for a moment. Then you decide what matters with what you can prove. That sounds very mature. I hate it too. I laughed, and the frustration eased just enough to become bearable. The dead end lasted less than 24 hours. Patrick called me the next morning, but because my contact with him was now part of the review environment, I did not answer until I had checked with General Counsel. She called him herself first, confirmed he was not trying to provide confidential transaction information, and then told me I could speak with him about my historical employment as long as I documented the conversation. When I called back, Patrick sounded irritated with himself. I should have remembered this sooner. What? The migration. I know about the migration. That's why I remembered. He explained that the finance team had never fully trusted electronic migrations for historical valuation work. Not because they expected misconduct, but because old models, board packages, signed certifications, and supporting schedules sometimes lost formatting or metadata when systems changed. For years, finance had maintained authorized hard copy closing and reporting binders for significant annual cycles. It was the kind of habit younger employees mocked until someone needed a document from a system that no longer existed. Were there binders from 2021? I asked. Yes. Do they still exist? I don't know. My disappointment must have been audible. Jessica, that isn't the important part. The important part is that if the retention schedule was followed, there should be an off-site box tied to the year-end finance records. Can you check? No. He answered so quickly I almost smiled. I know. I was testing you. Don't. Fair. Patrick told me he had already contacted Langford's records administrator and the independent directors through the proper internal channel to issue a preservation notice. He had not requested the binder be opened or sent to him. He had simply documented that potentially relevant hard copy finance records from 2021 might exist and should not be destroyed or moved while the governance question remained active. That mattered more than if he had driven to a warehouse himself and pulled a dusty folder from a shelf. A preservation notice created a trail. It meant Patrick was finally willing to put his name on the fact that something might matter. What was in the binder? I asked. I don't remember every page. What do you remember? Valuation working papers, management equity schedules, board reporting materials, sometimes printed correspondence attached to review notes. My pulse picked up. Correspondence with counsel? Possibly, but if there is privileged material, you will not get it directly. I understand. He paused. I mean it, Jessica. Do not turn this into a treasure hunt. If the binder exists, independent directors and their lawyers need to handle it. I understand. 5 years ago, you would have tried to find the storage facility yourself. 5 years ago, I worked there. You know what I mean. I did. The old version of me would have believed the fastest route to the truth was automatically the best one. The woman sitting in my Cedar Bridge office knew better. Evidence could be damaged by the wrong person touching it. A correct fact could become useless if obtained through a process nobody trusted. Did you send the preservation notice already? I asked. Yes. When? This morning. That stopped me. Patrick had not called to ask permission. He had acted within his own responsibility. For the first time since this began, he had chosen discomfort before someone forced him to. Thank you, I said. He was silent for a moment. Don't thank me yet. I'm not thanking you for 5 years ago. I know. I'm thanking you for this morning. Another silence. Then he said, That's fair. After we hung up, I documented the conversation and sent it to General Counsel. She acknowledged it, then reminded me I would not be involved in any retrieval. If the Langford independent directors decided the potential historical discrepancy warranted a formal investigation, their counsel would have to request the archive themselves. Cedar Bridge could not direct a target company to expose privileged legal files simply because one of its founders wanted answers. For once, I felt no urge to push. The irony was almost perfect. For years, Henry had mocked my insistence on documentation, retention, and review procedures because he believed people mattered more than paper. Now, a paper binder might be the only thing left that remembered what his digital systems had forgotten. I did not know whether it still existed. I did not know what was inside. I did not know whether it would prove Henry had been warned or only add another stack of ambiguous pages to the ones we already had. But the investigation was no longer asking whether my memory could defeat my father's memory. It was asking whether Langford's own records had preserved something neither of us could rewrite. That afternoon, General Counsel called me one last time before I left the office. Langford's independent directors received the preservation notice, she said. They're considering next steps. I looked through the glass wall toward the floor I had helped build, at employees moving through processes I had designed, long before I knew those same processes would one day turn toward my family. What happens if they find the binder? That depends on what's in it. And if they don't, then we work with what can be proven. It was the same answer Andre had given me, and I finally stopped resenting it. I had spent 5 years believing strength meant walking away and never looking back. Then I spent 2 weeks believing strength meant finding enough proof to force Henry to admit what he had done. By that point, I was beginning to understand something less satisfying and more useful. Strength was also knowing when not to touch the evidence yourself. Patrick had preserved the trail. The independent directors now knew where to look. And somewhere in an off-site records facility outside Richmond, there might still be a finance binder from the year my father erased me from his company. If it existed, I no longer wanted to be the person who opened it. I wanted the people with no reason to protect either of us to do it. The next development did not come from Patrick, Andre, or anyone at Cedar Bridge. It came from Langford's own board. 3 independent directors formed a special committee to investigate the 2021 classification of my departure, the management equity redemption tied to it, and whether any part of that history created a disclosure problem for the transaction now moving toward closing. They hired outside counsel that did not report to Henry, Amanda, Patrick, or Cedar Bridge. I learned this through a formal notice from our general counsel because, at that point, the process had finally crossed a line I had been waiting for since the first false record appeared on my screen. My father was no longer being asked to explain himself to me. He was being asked to explain himself to people whose job was to protect the company. I did not attend the committee meetings. I did not receive privileged legal communications, and nobody forwarded me whatever Henry said behind closed doors. That boundary became important later because, once the story started spreading inside Langford, several people assumed I must have known everything as it happened. I did not. Most of what I learned during those weeks came through formal, factual summaries, documents I was legally entitled to see, or conversations people later chose to have with me directly. That made the process slower than anger wanted, and stronger than anger could ever have made it. The committee's lawyers requested the off-site finance records Patrick had identified. The retrieval itself was almost painfully ordinary. No midnight warehouse, no dramatic lockbox. A records administrator located the 2021 year-end finance archive under Langford's retention schedule, documented the request, and released the relevant boxes to special committee counsel. Patrick later told me the binder had been exactly where the old inventory log said it should be, wedged among annual valuation files and board reporting packages nobody had touched in years. For 2 days, I heard nothing. On the third afternoon, General Counsel asked me to join a call. Melissa was there again, along with one of Cedar Bridge's outside transaction lawyers. I knew immediately from the number of attorneys involved that the binder had contained something worth discussing. "We have factual findings from the special committee," General Counsel said. "Not privileged communications. I want that distinction clear." "I understand." The first finding confirmed what we already suspected. The finance binder contained an original valuation working paper that treated my departure as a termination, not a voluntary resignation. Patrick's written objection to the later classification was attached to a review schedule. There were also board reporting materials showing that my management units had originally been evaluated under the more favorable formula before the final redemption package changed. None of that was new enough to surprise me. What changed everything was the sequence. The special committee had been able to establish that the classification issue had been raised internally before the final redemption was completed. It had not been invented years later by a bitter former employee. It had been discussed at the time. I asked the obvious question. Did they establish that Henry knew? There was a brief pause before our general counsel answered. Yes. I stopped breathing for a second. She continued carefully. Special committee counsel had reviewed communications between Langford and company counsel that I was not entitled to see directly. Those communications remained subject to privilege, and Cedar Bridge had not been given the underlying emails. But the committee was authorized to report factual conclusions necessary for the governance review. The conclusion was simple. Company counsel had warned Henry in 2021 that my separation classification was inconsistent with the underlying facts and should be corrected. Counsel had also warned that leaving the record unresolved could create problems in future financing, ownership representations, or due diligence. Henry had been told. Not vaguely. Not through gossip. Not years later. At the time, I stared at the notebook in front of me until the ruled lines blurred. For weeks, I had wanted proof that Patrick's memory was real. Now that I had it, the feeling was nothing like satisfaction. My father had known. That was the part I could not get past. If Henry had believed I resigned, then the story was ugly but simple. He had been racist, controlling, and wrong. If an HR employee had chosen the wrong phrase, then the economic damage might have been negligence. Even if Henry had been careless, carelessness was still different from choice. But he had been warned. He had been told the classification should be corrected, and he had left it alone. I asked whether the committee knew why. The transaction attorney answered this time. The factual report says Henry resisted changing the separation language because doing so would have triggered questions about the reason for your termination. That sentence sat in the conference room like a weight. I knew what the reason was. So did my mother. So did Henry. If the board had been told that the director of operations had been terminated without performance issues because she refused to cancel a marriage to a black man, Henry would have had to defend more than a staffing decision. He would have had to defend his judgment. For 5 years, I had told myself my father disowned me because his prejudice mattered more to him than his daughter. I had never fully considered what happened after the door closed behind me. He had gone back upstairs to a company full of people who knew my work. People who knew I had been on the leadership track. People who would have asked why I was suddenly gone. Voluntary departure answered that question for him. It made me the one who left. It made Henry the man who had been abandoned, rather than the man who had done the abandoning. And it made the lower redemption calculation easier to justify. I asked whether the special committee had concluded that Henry changed the record specifically to reduce my payout. No, General Counsel said. They have not made that finding. The clarification mattered. I wrote it down. What have they concluded? That he knew the classification was disputed, knew it did not align cleanly with the underlying separation, was advised to correct it, and chose not to. I nodded slowly. That was enough. Not for every legal conclusion a television drama might have wanted. Enough for me. The story could no longer be dismissed as an administrative misunderstanding. Then the transaction attorney told me there was more. The special committee's review of the binder had led them to a later financing package. Several years after I left, Langford had refinanced part of its debt. As part of that process, Henry signed representations concerning ownership history, management equity obligations, and unresolved claims involving former executives. Those representations relied on the same clean narrative that I had voluntarily left and that the related redemption had been properly resolved. The old classification had not simply stayed buried in an inactive personnel file. Henry had relied on it again. Did he sign that personally? I asked. Yes. That was the moment the situation changed from history into governance. If the mistake had happened once in 2021 and then disappeared, Henry could still argue that he had failed to correct an ugly internal problem. But years later, after being warned, he had put his name under another transaction document that treated the issue as closed. I thought about all the times Henry had taught me that a signature meant something. He used to say executives were paid for the moment everyone else could say they only prepared the paper and the person at the top still had to put their name beneath it. Apparently that lesson had survived better in me than in him. Does this affect the current deal? I asked. Yes, the transaction lawyer said. Potentially in a significant way. They would not tell me whether Cedar Bridge should still invest. That decision belonged to the independent investment committee I had recused from. What they could tell me was that the special committee now considered the issue material enough to expand its investigation from historical record correction into leadership and governance. When the call ended, I stayed in the conference room alone for several minutes. I expected anger to arrive. Instead, I thought about the younger version of myself, sitting in an attorney's office in 2021, deciding not to fight. That woman had believed Henry held all the records, all the money, all the leverage, and therefore all the truth that mattered. She had not known that somewhere inside Langford, Patrick had raised a question. She had not known company counsel had warned Henry. She had not known the version of events that made her feel weak had required active maintenance. I wished I could go back and tell her. Not to sue. Not to stay. Just to tell her she had not imagined it. Andre came home later than usual that night. He had been briefed separately at the level his role allowed, which meant he had received the same non-privileged factual conclusions without participating in the investment committee. He walked into the kitchen, put his keys down, and stood there looking at me. "I want us out," he said. I had known those words were coming. I closed my laptop. "No." His eyebrows rose. "You don't even know what I was going to say. You want Cedar Bridge to walk away from Langford." "Yes." "That's not your decision. I know that." "Then why are we arguing?" "Because, if the committee asks for my view as managing partner outside the vote, my view is that I don't want our capital anywhere near Henry." I studied his face. This was not the furious husband from a revenge fantasy. Andre looked like an investor who had just read enough about management integrity to decide he did not trust the person at the top. He knowingly left a false governance problem unresolved, Andre said. Then he relied on it again in a financing document. The special committee hasn't called it fraud. I didn't call it fraud. You're thinking like my husband. I'm thinking like both. That's exactly the problem. He stared at me. I thought you wanted accountability. I do. Then why are you defending the deal? I'm not defending Henry. You're defending a transaction that keeps his company standing. No, I'm defending the difference between his company and him. Andre crossed his arms. Langford still employed hundreds of people. It had good projects, valuable assets, strong regional relationships, and managers who had nothing to do with what happened to me. The current transaction still made economic sense if the governance problem could be fixed. Cedar Bridge's investors had not entrusted us with their money, so Andre and I could use it to settle private debts. I told him all of that. He listened without interrupting. If the independent committee decides Henry makes the deal too risky, They should reject it, I said. If they decide the company is worth investing in only with new governance, then they should require new governance. But if Cedar Bridge walks because you and I hate what he did, he gets to spend the rest of his life saying this was revenge. I don't care what he says. I do. Andre's expression hardened. Why? Because I spent 5 years letting him own the version of what happened. The answer came out sharper than I intended. I slowed down. I don't need him to like the result. I need the result to survive him. If this ends with you pulling the plug because you love me, then every person who wants to excuse Henry gets an easy explanation. Angry daughter, protective husband, family feud. And if we continue, then he has to face people who don't care about our marriage. Andre looked away. That's what you want, he said. Yes, you want the system to do it. I want the facts to survive without either of us bending them. He was quiet for a long time. Then he walked to the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. Do you know what I hate? I can guess several things. I hate that you're right about this. I'm going to enjoy that sentence later. Don't. I smiled despite myself. He opened the bottle but did not drink. If the committee says walk, we walk. Yes. If the committee says proceed with conditions, we don't soften them because Henry is your father. Absolutely not. And you don't ask me to be gracious at closing. I would never insult you like that. That finally made him smile. The disagreement ended there because neither of us needed to win it. Andre still wanted out. I wanted the process to continue. The committee would decide what neither of us had the right to decide personally. That was the point. The next week, the special committee requested additional time before Langford could finalize several governance representations required for Cedar Bridge's transaction. The reason stated in the formal notice was broad enough to protect privileged details and specific enough to terrify any founder who liked controlling the room. Historical management equity issues and related leadership disclosures required remediation before closing. I learned later that Henry tried to characterize the investigation as unnecessary. I did not know what he said in the room. I did know what came out of it. The committee was no longer asking whether my old personnel record needed correction. It was asking whether the man who had refused to correct it could still be trusted to lead the company through the largest transaction of his career. That distinction mattered more than any apology Henry could have given me. For years, he had treated my marriage to Andre as a test of whether I was loyal enough to remain a Langford. Now, Langford's independent directors were preparing a different test. Not whether Henry loved his family. Whether his company could afford to keep trusting his judgment. The special committee's preliminary findings arrived through council on a Tuesday morning, and by then I had learned not to expect dramatic language from documents that could change people's lives. The report did not call my father corrupt. It did not call my sister dishonest. It did not mention racism in the first paragraph or describe what happened to me as a betrayal. It used colder words, inaccurate classification, unresolved governance issue, knowledge of inconsistency, subsequent reliance, corrective action required. That was how institutions spoke when emotion had become evidence. What mattered was what those words meant. The committee concluded that I had not voluntarily resigned in 2021, that Henry knew there was a serious question about the classification, that he had been advised to correct it, and that he later signed financing documents that continued to rely on the cleaner version of my departure. The report recommended recalculating my management equity redemption and correcting the corporate record. It also said the issue raised questions about leadership judgment that the full board would need to address before Cedar Bridge's transaction could proceed. Amanda appeared in the report too, but differently. The committee had found an internal succession document from several years after I left. Amanda had signed it as part of an executive development process. One section summarized management departures relevant to succession planning and described me as having voluntarily left the company. On its own, the document proved very little. Amanda could have relied on corporate records she had no reason to question. What changed that was what she had already admitted to me. By then, she knew there had been an argument inside the family about whether I had actually resigned. The committee was not accusing her of falsifying anything. It was examining whether she knowingly accepted a version of events that benefited her succession path because challenging it might have threatened the position Henry had given her. I read that section 3 times. There was a time when seeing Amanda face consequences would have felt satisfying in the uncomplicated way people imagine revenge should feel. By then, it mostly made me tired. I did not want her destroyed. I wanted the lie to stop protecting everyone who had benefited from it. My mother asked to see me 2 days later. She did not want to talk on the phone this time. She drove to Washington and asked if we could meet somewhere private. I chose a quiet hotel lounge near Cedar Bridge, not because I wanted neutral territory anymore, but because I no longer wanted family conversations in my home. Constance arrived wearing a pale gray suit, and the expression she used at charity luncheons when something had gone wrong behind the scenes, and she needed everyone to believe it had not. She ordered tea she barely touched, and spent the first minute asking about traffic. I let her. I had learned that people often revealed what they were afraid to say by how long they delayed saying it. Finally, she folded her hands around the cup. I've seen enough to understand the board is taking this seriously. I assumed they would. Your father thinks they're overreacting. That also doesn't surprise me. She looked down. There is one thing I need to ask you. I waited. If this becomes public, does Andre's race have to be part of it? For a moment, I did not answer, because I wanted to be certain I had heard her correctly. You're asking whether the reason Dad fired me should be left out. I'm asking whether every private family failure needs to become part of a corporate record. It became corporate when he fired an executive over it. He believed he was protecting the family. That isn't a defense. I didn't say it was. You've been saying versions of it for 5 years. Her face tightened. I am trying to protect what is left. Of what? Our family. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about how sincerely she believed that word still belonged to her. You want me to protect the family by helping erase why I was thrown out of it. That is not what I said. It is exactly what you are asking. Constance's eyes filled, but she did not cry. She had always been disciplined with emotion, especially when emotion might make someone else uncomfortable. Your father made one terrible mistake. I shook my head. No, the mistake was what he said in that office. Everything after that had a date on it. She stared at me. He had time to correct the record. He didn't. He was warned. He didn't. He signed another financing package years later using the same story. That isn't one mistake. That's a series of choices. You want him humiliated. I haven't leaked a single document. That doesn't mean you don't want it. I considered lying. Then I decided she deserved more honesty than she had given me. There were days I wanted him humiliated, I said. I wanted him to walk into a room and understand exactly what it felt like to have somebody else decide your worth before you opened your mouth. But wanting something and building your life around getting it are different things. She looked at me carefully. I'm not stopping the review, I continued. I'm not asking anyone to publish private family details for entertainment, but I will not help create another false version because the truth embarrasses him. My mother looked suddenly older than 64. If you do this, there may not be a way back. I had heard that threat before. Only this time, it had no power. Mom, there hasn't been a way back for 5 years. You just kept pretending the road was still there. Amanda called me that evening. Unlike our last conversation, she did not begin by defending Henry. She asked if she could come to my office after hours. I checked with counsel because her name now appeared in the governance review, and they told me a personal conversation was allowed as long as I did not discuss confidential transaction terms or solicit company documents. She arrived after 7, looking less polished than she had at the coffee shop. No jacket, hair pulled back, no performance. I told the committee everything I know, she said after sitting down. I waited. They asked when I first knew you hadn't resigned. What did you tell them? That Mom said it about a year after you left. That matched what she had told me before. Amanda rubbed her palms against her knees. They also asked about the succession memo. And? I told them I knew the wording bothered me. Bothered you how? She looked at me. Because by then, I knew Dad didn't really believe you had walked in and quit. He believed marrying Andre meant you chose to leave. That's not the same thing. No. I signed it anyway. There was no excuse in the sentence. That mattered. I thought if I challenged it, the whole thing would reopen, she said. And if it reopened, the board would ask why I got moved into leadership so fast after you left. They should have. I know. That answer surprised me more than anything else she had said. Amanda leaned back and looked toward the dark glass wall of my office. Do you know what the worst part is? What? I didn't think of it as taking something from you. I thought of it as finally getting something for me. I understood that. I did not forgive it. I can understand why you were afraid to lose the first thing Dad made you feel was yours, I said. That doesn't make staying quiet right. I know. You don't get to make me the price of being chosen. She closed her eyes briefly. I know that too. For the first time, she did not ask what I wanted her to do. There was nothing I could do for her anyway. The board would decide whether her succession role survived. Her future was finally connected to her own choices rather than Henry's promises. 2 days after Amanda's interview, a trade reporter emailed Cedar Bridge asking for comment on leadership review rumors involving Langford Commercial Group. I had no idea who had talked. It could have been a banker, a lawyer, an employee, or someone who noticed the transaction slowing down. The reporter specifically asked whether my history with Langford had affected Cedar Bridge's investment decision. There was a version of me from 3 weeks earlier who might have enjoyed answering that question carefully enough to burn Henry without technically leaking anything. I forwarded the email to General Counsel instead. Our response said Cedar Bridge did not comment on active transaction processes and that any corporate governance announcements concerning Langford should come from Langford itself. That was all. Andre read the statement and said, "You know you could have ended him with one phone call." I know. Does that disappoint you? A little. He smiled. So, you're human. Unfortunately, the restraint turned out to matter sooner than I expected. The special committee issued its formal remediation recommendation the following week. I did not sit in the meeting where the board first received it. What I knew came from the factual summary council was permitted to give Cedar Bridge after the recommendation was formally adopted for negotiation. The committee wanted 4 things before closing. First, Langford had to correct the historical record and acknowledge that I had been terminated rather than voluntarily resigned. Second, the company had to recalculate my management equity redemption and negotiate restitution for the shortfall. Third, the board had to separate the chairman and CEO functions and install independent oversight. Fourth, Henry's leadership had to transition, and Amanda could no longer remain on the automatic succession track while her own certification issue was unresolved. I read the summary twice. Andre was across the conference table from me. Neither of us had voted on the recommendation. Neither of us had drafted it. "This is what you wanted," he said. "Some of it. What part didn't you want?" I looked at Amanda's name. I wanted her to make better choices before this. Andre nodded. "That wasn't available." "No." The board met the next morning. I was not there. By then I had stopped imagining the scene. I did not know who raised their voice, who looked away, or whether Henry used the same cold tone he had used with me 5 years earlier. Later that afternoon, I received the formal transaction update from Cedar Bridge Council. It said Langford had not yet accepted the remediation package, and that closing preparation was paused, pending board and shareholder support. Patrick called after work. His voice sounded exhausted. "I can tell you what's in the approved minutes," he said. "Nothing more." "That's enough." According to the minutes, Henry called the remediation terms excessive. He argued that a private family dispute from 5 years earlier was being weaponized against the founder of the company. He said the transaction had become hostile and announced that if Cedar Bridge required his resignation and the governance changes, there would be no deal. I asked Patrick what happened next. There was a pause. Then he said, he looked around the table. And? Nobody moved. I did not need Patrick to tell me what Henry felt. For the first time in his career, my father had threatened to take his company home with him, and the room had finally reminded him that it was not his alone. The board did not collapse after my father announced there would be no deal. That was the first thing Henry had miscalculated. For most of his career, threatening to walk away had been enough to make other people move toward him. Vendors shaved margins. Bankers found another structure. Executives softened language. Even at home, My mother usually found a way to turn Henry's refusal into everybody else's obligation to compromise. This time, the company was too large, the transaction too far along, and the consequences too measurable for anyone to pretend his pride was the only thing at stake. I learned that through the non-privileged financial summary Cedar Bridge's counsel was allowed to share with me after Langford's board reviewed its alternatives. If the transaction died, Langford Commercial Group would not collapse the next morning. That mattered to me. I did not want some melodramatic version of events in which my father signed because otherwise hundreds of people instantly lost their jobs. The reality was more complicated and, in some ways, more punishing. Without the Cedar Bridge-led recapitalization, the regional acquisition Henry had spent nearly 2 years pursuing would almost certainly die. Langford would have to refinance existing debt under less favorable conditions. Bonding capacity would tighten. Several planned projects would have to be delayed or reprioritized. The company could survive, but smaller, more constrained, and under lenders who would ask harder questions about leadership after the governance review. That was what Henry was actually choosing between. Not survival and ruin, control and consequence. Cedar Bridge's independent investment committee met without Andre or me. The conflict screen remained in place. I did not receive the underwriting materials, hear the debate, or know who argued for continuing the transaction. By then, I had stopped trying to imagine rooms I was not in. I learned the result only after the committee issued its formal approval. The deal could proceed, but not under the structure Henry wanted. General Counsel walked me through the conditions, because several affected me directly. The historical record had to be corrected to reflect that I had been terminated in 2021 rather than voluntarily resigned. Langford had to complete a negotiated restitution settlement based on the management equity shortfall. An independent chairman would replace Henry at closing. Henry would leave the CEO role under a short transition arrangement. Amanda would be removed from the automatic executive succession track while the board resolved her own certification issue. The shareholder and governance agreements would be amended to give the independent directors more authority over certain related party and disclosure matters. Henry also had to sign several documents himself. That detail was important. He still owned roughly 37% of Langford's voting shares. He did not have majority control, but he was not powerless. The transaction required his founder support agreement, rollover consent, governance amendments, and the settlement and release tied to my historical equity issue. He could refuse. If he did, the current Cedar Bridge transaction would fail in its negotiated form. What he could not do was force the board to keep him as CEO and chairman just because he refused to sign. For the first time, those were separate questions. Andre requested that any direct conversation Henry wanted with him occur through counsel. Henry accepted, although I doubted he enjoyed needing permission to call the son-in-law he had once treated as if he were beneath the family. I was not on the call. Andre told me about it afterward, and counsel's summary confirmed the parts that mattered. Henry accused him of hiding behind committees. He said Cedar Bridge had turned a family dispute into a corporate coup. He implied that Andre had spent years waiting for an opportunity to humiliate him. Andre did not take the bait. He explained that he had not voted on the investment, had not negotiated the remediation package, and had been screened from the transaction because of the exact conflict Henry was now complaining about. The terms came from the Independent Investment Committee after reviewing Langford's special committee findings. Henry apparently asked, "And if I refuse?" Andre's answer was simple. "Then this transaction doesn't close under these terms." Henry pushed harder. He wanted Andre to admit that Cedar Bridge would walk if he stayed. Andre refused to give him that satisfaction. He told Henry Cedar Bridge would execute whatever the independent committee approved, provided all closing conditions were satisfied. Leadership at Langford was a matter for Langford's board and shareholders, not Andre's personal preference. When Andre told me about the call, I could hear how much restraint it had taken. "You didn't mention 2021? No. You didn't mention what he said about you? No. You didn't tell him this was the closest he was ever getting to an apology?" Andre looked at me. I thought about it. I smiled. "That's growth. Don't make me regret it." The next conversation was mine. Henry asked to meet with me in Richmond, before the full board reconvened. I cleared it with counsel first. The meeting would concern my restitution, settlement, and personal history, not Cedar Bridge's investment decision. I drove down in the morning and met him in a conference room at Langford, rather than his office. That was his choice. I noticed it immediately. His office had always been a theater of authority. Dark wood, framed awards, construction photographs. The model of Langford's first major commercial project displayed behind his desk. If Henry wanted to remind somebody who he was, that was where he took them. The conference room was neutral. He was already seated when I arrived. For the first time in my life, my father looked older than the company. Not frail, Henry had never been physically fragile, but tired in a way expensive suits could not hide. He had papers in front of him, and reading glasses folded beside them. He did not ask how the drive was. "You got what you wanted," he said. "I haven't signed the settlement." "That isn't what I meant." I sat across from him. "What do you think I wanted?" He looked at me as if the answer were obvious. My chair, my authority, Amanda removed, my name dragged through a governance review. I didn't vote on any of that. You didn't have to. There was the old Henry again. If he could not attack an action, he attacked influence. If he could not prove influence, he attacked motive. I stayed quiet. He pushed a document toward me. It was not the formal settlement agreement. It was a handwritten list of what he believed could still be negotiated. Langford would correct my departure classification. The company would pay the equity shortfall and a negotiated financing adjustment. Henry would accept an independent chairman for a limited period. In return, he wanted the final governance findings to avoid specific language about the reason for my termination, and he wanted to remain CEO through the planned acquisition. I looked up. "You're negotiating with the wrong person." His jaw tightened. "You can influence Cedar Bridge." "I'm recused." "You can influence Andre." "I'm not going to." "You expect me to believe my daughter has no influence over her own husband?" "I expect you to understand that influence isn't the same as entitlement." That landed harder than I intended. Henry leaned back. "You have always been good at turning words into weapons." "No. You just spent a long time around people who stopped correcting you." He stared at me. I picked up the paper and placed it back in front of him. "The special committee decides what goes into its findings. Cedar Bridge's independent committee decided its terms. Your board decides who leads Langford. I decide whether I accept the settlement owed to me. Those are 4 different decisions. You could make this easier. For you. For everyone." I almost laughed because I had heard that argument my entire life. Make dinner easier. Make Christmas easier. Make Amanda's promotion easier. Make Dad's temper easier. Make the family easier. The person asked to make things easier was always the person expected to absorb the cost. "You're still doing it," I said. "Doing what?" "Taking something you want and calling it what everyone needs." His expression hardened. "This company employs hundreds of people, and I haven't asked anyone to shut it down. You know what happens if I don't sign?" "Yes. This deal fails." "And that means nothing to you?" "It means a lot to me. That's why I'm not asking Andre to pull it." That stopped him. For a moment, I could see him recalculating. "You told him not to walk?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because this should not be decided by whether my husband hates you." Henry's mouth tightened at the word hates. "I wanted people with no reason to protect me or punish you to look at the evidence," I continued. "They did. And now you think they're neutral?" "I think they're more neutral than either of us." He looked down at the papers. Then his voice changed. Not softer, exactly. More personnel. "You could have come to me." He stared at him. "When? When you found the discrepancy." "I did come to you. 5 years ago, I told you I was not resigning." "That was not the same thing." "No, it was worse." Henry rubbed his thumb along the edge of the table. "I was trying to keep a private family matter from becoming a public corporate scandal. You fired a senior executive over a private family matter. I was protecting what I built." There it was. The sentence I think he had believed from the beginning. Not "I was protecting you." Not "I was protecting Amanda." Not even "I was protecting the family." What I built. "You were protecting control," I said. His eyes lifted. "That isn't the same thing." You have no idea what it takes to build something like this. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt strangely calm. I built Cedar Bridge. His expression flickered, not because he had forgotten, because some part of him still thought of Cedar Bridge as Andre's company where I worked. That realization hurt less than it once would have. You think paperwork built that? He asked. No, people built it. Paperwork kept powerful people from deciding the rules only applied when they liked the result. He looked away. I wondered if he remembered the arguments we used to have over controls. I wondered if he remembered calling me difficult because I insisted approvals be documented even when he had already shaken someone's hand. I did not ask. You always made everything harder than it needed to be, he said. I know, and now those systems are being used against me. No, they're being used on you. There's a difference. He did not like that, but he did not have an answer. When I left, I did not feel victorious. I had not changed Henry's mind. He still believed the governance review was an attack. He still believed the original problem was a family disagreement that outsiders had inflated. He still believed losing control of Langford was disproportionate to what he had done. What had changed was that his belief was no longer the deciding factor. The full board reconvened 2 days later. I was not present. Neither was Andre. I learned what happened from approved minutes, the formal transaction update, and later from Patrick, where the minutes left procedural details unclear. Amanda recused herself from the portion involving her succession certification. That removed one reliable Henry vote from the room. The 3 independent directors supported the remediation package. One of Henry's longtime allies joined them after reviewing the downside analysis and special committee findings. That was enough. The board approved the leadership transition and restructuring terms. Henry would no longer be chairman at closing. His CEO transition would begin immediately and end under the negotiated schedule. The board authorized the amended governance structure subject to the required shareholder approvals. Outside the family bloc, enough shareholders had already indicated support that Henry could not count on stopping the amendments through ownership alone. He still had one card, his own signature. Patrick called after the meeting. He hasn't signed yet, he told me. Do you think he will? I stopped predicting Henry a long time ago. What happens if he doesn't? The board still changes leadership. The Cedar Bridge transaction fails. Then we refinance without it, probably on worse terms, and the acquisition is dead. So refusing doesn't keep him CEO. No, that was the trap Henry had built for himself. If he refused to sign, he lost the transaction and still lost control. If he signed, he preserved the company's expansion, but personally accepted the governance structure, ending his rule. There was no version in which he returned to the morning before the records were opened. The next day, counsel sent me the final restitution calculation. Langford Commercial Group had recomputed my 2021 management equity redemption using the termination formula. After negotiating the historical financing adjustment, the amount owed to me was a little over what I had estimated. I stared at the number. It was close enough to the capital Andre and I had struggled not to pull from Cedar Bridge during those early years that I had to close the document for a minute. Not identical, not magical, just close enough to make the past feel expensive in a new way. Henry had not caused every hard decision we made after 2021. I refused to give him that much importance. Cedar Bridge would still have been difficult. We still would have taken risks. We still would have had nights when hiring one more person felt dangerous. But the money Langford owed me would have bought time. I signed the settlement. I did not write, "Keep it." I did not donate it to prove I was better than them. I did not tell myself money did not matter. It was mine. The company had underpaid me because it treated a firing as a resignation. Correcting that did not make me greedy. It made the books accurate. Henry signed the restructuring package late the following afternoon. I did not see him do it. The signed founder support agreement arrived through counsel. So did the governance consent and the settlement documents. His signature sat beneath pages that transferred the chairmanship to an independent director, formalized his CEO transition, strengthened board oversight, and ended the assumption that Amanda would inherit control simply because Henry wanted her to. He had spent 5 years protecting a false record because correcting it might have raised questions about why he fired me. Now the correction had cost him almost every layer of authority he had been trying to protect. Closing was scheduled for the following week in Washington. By then, Henry knew Cedar Bridge's independent investment committee had approved the transaction. He knew Andre was a managing partner. He knew neither Andre nor I had voted. He knew the conflict screen had kept us out of negotiations from the beginning. What he did not know was who Cedar Bridge would designate to execute the final authorization after every condition was certified. I learned that only when General Counsel sent the closing assignment. I read the name once, then again, Andre Mitchell. For 8 weeks, my father had convinced himself the conflict protocol meant Andre would never touch his deal. He was wrong. The protocol had made sure Andre could not punish him. Now that the independent process was finished, it also meant something Henry had never considered. Andre did not need to punish him. He only needed to sign. My father arrived at Cedar Bridge's Washington office 9 minutes early for closing, and that detail told me more about his state of mind than anything he said that morning. Henry Langford had always treated punctuality as a form of hierarchy. Arriving exactly on time meant you belonged in the room. Arriving late meant the room could afford to wait for you. Arriving early was something he associated with people who needed favors, contracts, money, or permission. I had spent most of my childhood watching him make other people wait in hotel lobbies and conference rooms because he believed power was partly the ability to control somebody else's clock. So, when he stepped through the glass doors before the closing team had finished arranging the final packets, wearing the same navy suit he favored for lender meetings and major announcements, I understood that he no longer felt completely in control of what was about to happen. I was already in the boardroom when he arrived. My presence had been approved and documented because several closing conditions involved operational certifications, the historical record correction, and the restitution settlement that directly concerned me. I was not there as an investment decision-maker. I had not voted on the transaction, negotiated the economics, argued for or against Henry's leadership, or helped structure the conditions Cedar Bridge imposed. That distinction had become more important to me with every week that passed. If anyone eventually claimed I had used my position to punish my father, I wanted the paper trail to be boring enough to destroy the accusation before it became interesting. My role that morning was narrow, visible, and legitimate, exactly the way I wanted it. Henry saw me as soon as he entered. His eyes moved around the room first, taking inventory the way he always had. Cedar Bridge attorneys, representatives from the bank group, our head of acquisitions, Langford's transaction counsel, Patrick with the finance team, 2 executives from the institutional side of the consortium. Then his gaze returned to me, and for a second I could almost see him trying to decide which version of me he was supposed to address, his daughter, his former employee, Cedar Bridge's COO. The person whose corrected record had become one of the conditions attached to the biggest transaction of his career. He settled for a nod. I gave him one back. Amanda was not there. Her removal from the automatic succession track had already taken effect, and the board had kept her away from final execution while it completed the review of her own certification issue. That absence mattered more than I expected. For years, Henry had spoken about Langford's future, as if the succession order were a family inheritance rather than a corporate responsibility. First me, then Amanda. The company might have had directors, lenders, contracts, and shareholders, but in Henry's mind, leadership still moved through blood. The empty chair where Amanda would once have expected to sit said that assumption was gone. Patrick sat 3 seats away from Henry instead of beside him. Nobody announced that separation. Nobody needed to. Patrick had spent decades as one of Henry's closest financial lieutenants. 5 years earlier, if Patrick entered a boardroom, he sat near my father because that was where decisions formed before everyone else understood they had already been made. Now he sat with the finance team and kept his attention on the documents. The distance between their chairs was only a few feet, but it represented 5 years of silence, one preserved binder, and a decision Patrick should have made much sooner. Henry placed his leather portfolio on the table, opened it, and began reviewing the documents arranged at his seat. His movements were slow and deliberate. Page tabs, final capitalization schedule, governance agreement, founder support documents. He checked the placement of each signature flag, as if precision itself might return authority to him. If I had not known him my entire life, I might have believed he was calm. But Henry only became that careful when he could not control the larger situation. He had already signed the restructuring package that ended his chairmanship and triggered his transition out of the CEO role. He had already accepted the restitution settlement. He had already watched the board approve a future that no longer depended on his personal approval. Closing was supposed to be the moment he salvaged the victory still available to him: the acquisition, the recapitalization, the stronger debt structure, the expansion he wanted attached to his legacy. What he did not know was who would execute the last authorization on Cedar Bridge's side. He knew Andre was a managing partner. That had never been secret. By the second week of the transaction, Langford's lawyers knew both of us had family conflicts and that Cedar Bridge had screened us from investment judgment. Henry had even spoken to Andre once in a council-supervised call. But Andre had not participated in negotiations, committee deliberations, pricing discussions, or remediation decisions. For 8 weeks, Henry had dealt with other people: our head of acquisitions, independent investment committee members, outside transaction counsel, compliance. To Henry, that separation had become proof that Andre was outside the deal. I understood why he thought that. Our conflict policy had done exactly what it was designed to do. It prevented Andre from deciding whether the company run by the man who once rejected him deserved Cedar Bridge capital. It prevented me from using operational authority to influence underwriting. But once the independent committee had approved the transaction and every condition had been satisfied, someone still had to execute for the fund. Under Cedar Bridge's governing documents, that responsibility belonged to an authorized managing partner. General counsel designated Andre because he had been walled off from the substantive decision and because his execution would be ministerial. He could not rewrite the terms, soften the governance conditions, or punish Henry by withholding approval after the committee had certified everything. His signature did not create the outcome, it completed it. That difference mattered to me more than the irony. Henry glanced toward the door after several minutes. Are we waiting for someone? Closing counsel checked the time. One final signatory. My father looked toward our head of acquisitions, clearly assuming the answer was sitting somewhere on Cedar Bridge's side of the table. The man only smiled politely and returned to his notes. I kept my eyes on the closing checklist. There are moments people imagine for years and then discover they feel completely different when they finally happen. I had never specifically fantasized about my father needing Andre's signature, but I would be lying if I said some part of me had not imagined Henry one day being forced to see the man he rejected as successful, respected, and impossible to dismiss. In those fantasies, Henry understood everything instantly. He regretted what he had done. Andre had some perfect sentence ready. I stood beside him, untouched by the past. Reality was quieter. The doors opened. Andre walked in beside Cedar Bridge's closing counsel. Our executives stood first. The lender representatives followed. The institutional partners rose almost automatically, the way people do when the senior authorized person enters at the point where final execution is about to happen. Patrick stood too, more slowly. Henry's hand had been halfway to his water glass. It stopped. For 1 second, he stayed seated. Then he stood with everyone else. Andre wore a charcoal suit, white shirt, and the expression he used when a meeting mattered enough that personality needed to get out of the way. He shook hands with the attorneys, thanked the banking representatives, acknowledged the investment committee observer, and moved toward the empty chair at the end of Cedar Bridge's side. Then he looked at Henry. Henry, my father answered after the smallest pause. Andre? That was all. 5 years earlier, Henry had told me Andre would never be one of us. He had said it with the certainty of a man who believed belonging was something he personally issued. Now Andre stood in a room full of executives who did not need Henry's permission to respect him. No one there cared whether he fit Langford's idea of family. They cared that he was a managing partner of the firm, leading the transaction, and the person authorized to execute the closing. I felt the old sentence move through my memory, without the pain it once carried. He'll never be one of us. The irony was not that Andre had finally become one of Henry's people. It was that he never needed to. Andre sat. Everyone else followed. Closing counsel began with the final certifications. There was no dramatic announcement, only a checklist. Financing facilities will be to fund. Consortium commitments confirmed. Shareholder approvals received. Governance amendments executed. Founder support documents complete. Acquisition conditions satisfied. The independent chairmanship effective as of closing. Henry's CEO transition active under the agreed schedule. My father listened without interruption. Then the attorney reached the item that concerned me. Historical separation records have been corrected in accordance with the special committee findings and the executed remediation agreement. I did not look at Henry. The attorney continued. The company record now reflects termination in May 2021 rather than voluntary resignation. A sentence. That was all it took to erase 5 years of Henry's preferred version. Not my memory. Not my feelings. Not a daughter's accusation. A corrected company record. The same company that had once documented me as the person who walked away, now documented what actually happened. Henry fired me. The next item was restitution. Historical management equity remediation has been fully funded under the settlement agreement. I had seen the wire confirmation earlier that morning. Langford Commercial Group had paid the shortfall created by using the wrong redemption formula, along with the negotiated financing adjustment. The money was already where it was supposed to be. I had accepted it without apology, because I had finally understood that refusing money legally owed to me would not make me principled. It would only allow Henry's old decision to keep costing me. Funded. That one word mattered. When people talk about family betrayal, they often reduce the damage to emotion because emotion is easier to discuss than spreadsheets. But what Henry did had not only embarrassed or hurt me, it altered an economic transaction. The false classification changed the amount Langford paid for my management units. That meant 5 years of calling it a family disagreement had always been incomplete. The company had benefited financially from the cleaner story. Now the books were corrected too. Closing counsel moved on. The revised governance agreement took effect. Related party matters would receive stronger independent oversight. Certain disclosure decisions could no longer be controlled by the founder-led executive structure alone. The automatic succession assumption attached to Amanda had been removed. Her future role would depend on a separate board process, not on Henry declaring her next in line. At that, my father finally interrupted. Is every remediation item going to be read into the closing record? The attorney looked at him without discomfort. Every item that is a closing condition. I know what the conditions are. Then this should be straightforward. Patrick lowered his eyes to his notes. I almost felt sorry for my father, because I knew exactly what was happening inside that moment, even though I could not claim to know his thoughts. Henry had spent his entire career controlling which facts became formal. That was part of leadership as he understood it. Private mistakes stayed private. Family problems stayed family problems. Uncomfortable truths became softer language in minutes. Now every correction he resisted had been turned into a closing condition someone else was reading aloud. Nobody insulted him. Nobody laughed. Nobody mentioned race. That was what made the exposure so complete. There was no revenge performance he could point to afterward. Only documents. By the time the final Cedar Bridge authorization packet reached Andre, the room had settled into the silence that comes before execution. My father leaned back and looked at me. So this is what you wanted. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Several people heard him. Nobody pretended they had not. I placed my pen beside my notes. No. Henry gave a short, bitter laugh. Of course not. I wanted my record corrected. And everything else just happened around you? I didn't vote on this deal. You didn't have to. I understood immediately what he was doing. He had lost the argument over process, so he was moving to influence. If I could not be accused of voting, then I had influenced Andre. If Andre could not be accused of deciding the remediation terms, then his existence had intimidated the committee. Henry's story needed us to be responsible, because the alternative was that his own decisions had produced the outcome. I found a record about me that was false, I said. Then I disclosed the conflict and stepped away. You expect me to believe you had nothing to do with what followed? I expect you to understand the difference between triggering a review and controlling its result. Henry's eyes moved toward Andre. And him? He didn't vote either. That doesn't mean he had no influence. Andre remained silent. I could feel several people trying very hard not to become part of a family argument. I kept my voice level. The people who made these decisions were chosen because they had less personal interest than either of us. Henry stared at me. You built a machine, he said, and pointed it at my company. That sentence might have hurt me once because there was a piece of truth buried inside it. I had built much of Cedar Bridge's control architecture, conflict disclosures, approval matrices, document retention practices, independent review procedures. The things Henry used to mock when I worked for him. But he had the direction wrong. No, I said. I built a system that could look at facts without asking whose daughter I was. You always loved paperwork. I loved records people couldn't rewrite once everyone left the room. Something changed in his face then. Not defeat, not regret. Recognition, maybe. Henry remembered enough of our old arguments to understand exactly what I meant. He had once called my controls brakes. Now, they were the reason he could not accelerate past the truth. Do you think this proves you were right? He asked. I looked at the corrected closing documents. No, that answer surprised him. The documents prove what happened, I said. Whether I'm right about everything else is a different question. I meant it. I had made mistakes. I had delayed disclosure. I had spent years pretending I no longer cared what Henry thought. I had underestimated Amanda's insecurity and overestimated Patrick's willingness to act. I had sometimes confused independence with never needing anybody. Henry's failure did not make me infallible. That was one of the reasons this outcome felt real. My father turned toward Andre. And, you're comfortable signing this? Andre folded his hands on the table. The independent committee approved the transaction. That isn't what I asked. It's the answer that matters here. Henry's jaw tightened. You know what this does to me. Andre's expression remained calm. I know what the documents do to the company. You're avoiding the question. No, I'm refusing a different one. The room was completely silent now. Henry leaned forward slightly. You expect me to believe you don't enjoy this? Andre looked at him for several seconds. I knew my husband well enough to recognize the temptation to answer as a man rather than a managing partner. 5 years earlier, Henry had reduced him to race before learning anything else about him. He had forced me to choose. He had spent years pretending Andre was the reason our family fractured. If anyone in that room had earned the right to say something cruel, it was Andre. He did not. The investment was approved without my vote, he said. The governance conditions were established without my vote. Jessica's settlement was negotiated through counsel. My job now is to execute an approved transaction after the conditions have been certified. Henry gave him a thin smile. I'm sure that feels good. Andre looked down at the authorization packet, then back at my father. It feels like work. 4 words. That was all. I had to lower my eyes, because the reaction that moved through me was too close to laughter, relief, and love at the same time. Henry had spent 8 weeks imagining Andre as a man waiting to punish him. Andre refused to give him that importance. It feels like work. Not revenge. Not justice. Not victory. Work. The sentence stripped my father of the role he kept trying to claim. Henry was not the center of Andre's life. He was not the enemy Andre had been building toward for 5 years. He was the principal executive of a company whose transaction required a signature. Closing counsel slid the final authorization into place. Andre reviewed the certification page. He checked the signature block. He confirmed with counsel that every condition had been satisfied. No theatrical pause. No last look at me. No demand for an apology. No attempt to make Henry beg. Andre picked up his pen and signed. Andre Mitchell. The signature looked ordinary. That might have been the most extraordinary part. Closing counsel collected the executed page and announced that Cedar Bridge's authorization was complete. The bank representatives immediately moved to final funding confirmation. Langford Finance checked wire notices. One of our attorneys circulated executed copies. The head of acquisitions began reviewing post-closing responsibilities with the operating team. the deal was done. The biggest deal of my father's career had closed. Langford would refinance under stronger terms. The acquisition could move forward. The company would have additional capital for expansion. Employees who had nothing to do with our family war kept their jobs without becoming collateral damage in somebody else's revenge fantasy. Henry got almost everything he had wanted when the transaction began. Almost. He no longer controlled what the company became next. That consequence arrived less dramatically than the signature. An internal leadership announcement was distributed after closing. Henry would complete the agreed CEO transition and then step away from operational leadership. The independent chairman took effect immediately. The revised governance framework became active. Amanda was no longer presented as the automatic successor. The board, not Henry, would determine future executive leadership under the new structure. His name remained on the company. His shares remained his. He remained wealthy. Nobody escorted him from the building. Nobody froze his accounts. Nobody handcuffed him. That was never what I wanted. What Henry lost was the thing he had confused with ownership for most of his life. The assumption that his preference was the company's future. I watched him read the announcement on his phone. His face did not change. Then he put the phone away. Patrick approached me once the lender representatives began leaving. For a second, he looked like he wanted to say something formal, then abandoned the attempt. "Congratulations," he said. "I'm not sure that's the right word. For the deal." "That part, yes." He nodded. We stood together without speaking for a moment. Then Patrick said, "I should have done more in 2021. I looked at him. 5 years earlier, I would have wanted him to explain again. Mortgage, children, employees, staying inside the company. All the reasons he had told himself silence was responsible. I no longer needed the explanation. "You should have." He accepted it. I continued, "What you did now mattered." Patrick's shoulders lowered slightly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." He almost smiled. "Then what should I do? Next time you know something is wrong, don't wait until the person with less power has to prove it first." He nodded. "I can do that. That's enough." Andre came over after Patrick left. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so." That sounded very convincing. "I've had a long morning." "So have I." I glanced toward Henry. He was speaking quietly with one of the independent directors, his leather portfolio closed beside him. Andre followed my gaze. "Do you want me to stay?" I knew what he meant. "Not in the building. With me. There are times when someone standing beside you is support. There are other times when their presence becomes armor." I had used independence as armor for years, but this was not one of those moments. Henry and I had a conversation left that had nothing to do with Andre. "I'm okay." Andre studied me long enough to make sure I meant it. "I'll be downstairs." He kissed my temple. It was small, natural, almost automatic. Henry saw it. 5 years earlier, the sight of Andre touching me with affection had been enough to make my father talk about what kind of future I was choosing. Now he said nothing. Andre left. The room emptied gradually after him. Attorneys gathered their folders. Finance people carried laptops out. The independent director Henry had been speaking with left after a handshake that looked more professional than warm. Patrick followed the Langford team. I began organizing my own notes. "Jessica." I turned. Henry stood on the other side of the conference table with his portfolio under one arm. Without the lawyers, bankers, executives, and closing documents between us, he looked less like the founder of Langford Commercial Group. He looked like my father. That was harder. "I thought you'd come back someday," he said. For a moment I did not understand. "Come back where?" "Langford." The answer landed slowly. Henry had disowned me, fired me, allowed his company's records to say I walked away, paid my equity under the lower formula, refused to correct the record after counsel warned him, and somewhere beneath all of that, he had still believed I would return. Not because he planned to apologize. Because he assumed the life outside his approval would eventually fail. "You thought I'd come back after you fired me?" He looked toward the windows instead of at me. "I thought eventually you would understand that families survive things." I felt the old anger rise, but it no longer had the same authority over me. Families survive things when the people who cause the damage repair it. We were both angry. "You fired me because I married a black man." His eyes returned to mine. Do we really have to keep reducing everything to that? I stared at him. The sentence told me more than any apology would have. 5 years later, he still believed naming the prejudice was the simplification, not committing it. No, I said. That's what you did. He frowned. You reduced Andre to his race. You reduced me to whether I obeyed you. You reduced our marriage to a threat to the family you thought you owned. That isn't fair. You keep using that word when what you mean is uncomfortable. I gave you everything. There was a time that sentence would have destroyed me, because he had given me a lot. Education, access, a career path, responsibility, his attention. For years, I confused those things with unconditional love, because I had never tested the conditions. You gave me a future, I said, as long as I lived the one you chose. Henry's mouth tightened. You have no idea what it took to build Langford. I almost laughed. Not because the statement was absurd, because he still did not see me. I built Cedar Bridge. You helped build it. There it was. Small. Automatic. Even after everything Andre built, Jessica helped. 5 years earlier, that would have made me fight. That morning, it only clarified what I had spent too long wanting from him. Recognition was not something Henry knew how to give without making himself the person who measured it. I built Cedar Bridge with Andre, I said, and I don't need you to understand the difference. He looked at me. For once, I meant it. Henry glanced toward the closed boardroom doors Andre had walked through earlier. I never thought it would end like this. I believed him. That was the tragedy of my father. Henry had spent his entire adult life deciding consequences for other people. Employees, vendors, executives, his daughters. He understood cause and effect perfectly when he stood on the side issuing the decision. What he had never imagined was a system strong enough to issue one back. I picked up my folder. Jessica. I paused near the door. His voice was quieter the second time. I really did think you'd come back. I looked at him, and suddenly I understood what the last 5 years had really been about. Not just race, not just money, not even the company. Henry had believed leaving him was temporary, because he had never believed I could become someone whose future did not require his permission. He had assumed I would eventually miss the title, the money, the family name, the office, the promise of succession, something enough to return and accept his version of what happened. For years, part of me had wanted to prove him wrong by succeeding. That was still letting him set the test. The final thing I needed from Henry was not an apology. It was freedom from needing him to recognize that I had won. I opened the door. I did not answer his question that day, because the answer was not going to be another argument in a boardroom. It was going to come when Langford finally offered me back the future Henry had taken from me. And for the first time in my life, the choice would be mine. For the first few days after closing, I expected relief to feel cleaner than it did. The transaction was finished. My record had been corrected. Langford had paid the restitution it owed me. Henry was no longer chairman. His CEO transition was underway, and Amanda was no longer being treated as the automatic future of the company. Every outcome I had once believed I needed was now real, documented, and beyond my father's ability to explain away. Yet, when I woke up the morning after closing, I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Andre understood before I said anything. He did not ask whether I was happy. He made coffee, sat across from me at the kitchen table, and let the silence exist without trying to improve it. That was one of the things I loved about him most. Henry had always treated silence as a gap somebody needed to control. Andre understood that sometimes silence was simply where a feeling had not finished becoming language. Eventually, he asked whether I regretted anything. I told him I regretted waiting 2 days to disclose what I found, regretted not pushing harder 5 years earlier when the buyback looked wrong, and regretted spending so much time pretending I no longer cared what Henry thought. What I did not regret was marrying Andre, building Cedar Bridge, or refusing to kill a good transaction just to make my father suffer more. The public consequences arrived gradually. Langford issued a formal leadership announcement stating that Henry would step down from the CEO role under the transition plan, and that an independent chairman had assumed oversight responsibilities. The statement referenced a governance review connected to historical management equity matters, and said the company had completed remediation before closing. It did not describe every family detail, and I had no interest in making it do so. Trade publications picked up the leadership change because Henry had been identified with Langford for decades, and a few industry reporters noted that the transition followed an internal governance review. Nobody called him a criminal. Nobody needed to. The story people in his world understood was simpler. A founder who had spent years controlling every major decision had been forced to surrender authority after his own board decided his judgment could no longer be trusted without stronger oversight. I knew the reputational damage through public coverage and through the people who contacted Cedar Bridge afterward. Some expressed surprise, others did not. One banker who had worked with Langford years earlier told Andre that Henry had always treated governance as something for companies run by people he trusted less than himself. Andre repeated the comment to me only because it was almost funny in its precision. I did not need to imagine Henry alone in his house reading those articles or staring at a phone that no longer rang for permission. I knew enough from the facts I could see. Meetings moved forward without him. The acquisition integration was being handled by executives under the new structure. Decisions that would once have waited for Henry now went through the board process. He still had wealth, shares, and his last name on the building. What he lost was the expectation that every important room eventually turned toward him. My mother called the following week and invited Andre and me to dinner. Not lunch at a restaurant. Not coffee somewhere neutral. Dinner at my parents' house. The invitation was so familiar that for a moment I almost admired its audacity. Constance said she thought everyone needed a chance to move forward, now that the business matter was settled. She told me Henry had been through enough. Amanda was devastated, and there was no reason the family should continue punishing itself. By the time she finished, I realized she had managed to describe 5 years of racism, disownment, concealment, and corporate manipulation without naming a single person who had caused any of it. "I'm not coming," I said. She went quiet. "Jessica, please don't make a permanent decision while everyone is emotional." "This isn't emotional." "Then what is it?" "A boundary." She sighed. "I don't understand what more you want." The record was corrected. You got the money. Your father lost his positions. Amanda lost her future there. What else is supposed to happen? That question would have made me furious a month earlier. This time, I answered calmly. "I'm not asking for anything else to happen." "Then why can't we have dinner?" "Because none of those things fixed how you still talk about what happened." She started to interrupt, but I continued. "If you want a relationship with me, there are rules now. You do not call Dad's racism a generational misunderstanding. You do not ask Andre to prove he's the bigger person. You do not tell me that protecting the family means protecting whoever caused the damage, and you do not use guilt every time I say no." My mother was silent long enough that I checked the call had not dropped. Finally, she said, "That sounds very conditional." I almost smiled. Yes. The irony was too obvious to explain. Henry and Constance had once decided I belonged in the family only if I lived according to their conditions. The difference was that my conditions were not about whom they loved, what they looked like, or whether their choices flattered me. My conditions were about behavior. If they wanted access to my life, they had to stop demanding that I participate in lying about the past. I told her I was not going no contact that day, but I would decide how much contact felt healthy. She did not like it. For once, her dislike did not become my assignment. Amanda's call came 2 days later. She had officially been removed from the executive succession track. The board had not fired her from the company, but her position had been narrowed while the review of her certification and leadership judgment concluded. She told me she planned to leave Langford rather than spend years proving she deserved a seat. Everyone would now assume her father had given her. "You took my future," she said. Her voice cracked on the word future. I could have responded cruelly. There was a version of revenge where I reminded her that she had enjoyed my absence, signed documents built on a story she knew was wrong, and stayed quiet because honesty threatened her promotion. All of that was true. None of it required me to pretend I did not understand what she was losing. "No," I said. "Dad promised you a future he didn't have the right to guarantee." "That sounds like the same thing." "It isn't." To you, Amanda, I know you worked hard. I know Dad compared us in ways that hurt you. I know I contributed to that sometimes. But you also knew something was wrong and chose not to ask because your position depended on the answer staying buried. Both things can be true. She cried then, quietly enough that I knew she was trying not to let me hear. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. That was the first thing she said that did not blame me. Find out who you are when Dad isn't choosing for you. That's easy for you to say. No. It was expensive for me to learn. She laughed once through the tears, not because it was funny, but because the sentence landed. I did not offer her a job at Cedar Bridge. I did not call anyone on her behalf. I did not rescue her from consequences she had helped create. But I also did not tell her she was doomed. Amanda had spent years being told she was either behind me or replacing me. Maybe losing Henry's succession plan was the first chance she had ever had to build something that belonged to her. A little more than 2 weeks after closing, I received an email from Langford's independent chairman asking whether I would consider meeting with several. I almost deleted it. The meeting was held in Richmond, but not in Henry's office. The board used a smaller conference room on another floor, one I had spent hundreds of hours in during my years at the company. The chairman told me plainly that Langford needed operating credibility during the transition. Several longtime managers still trusted me. I understood the systems, the culture, the project structure, and the weaknesses the company needed to correct. He was careful not to offer me Henry's old chair like some ceremonial inheritance. Instead, he asked whether I would consider a board seat or a senior operating role with the possibility of broader leadership later. 5 years earlier, I would have said yes before he finished the sentence. That realization startled me. This was the future I had once believed Henry stole. The conference room, the company, the chance to become the person he had raised me to think I was supposed to be. For a few minutes, I let myself imagine it. Returning through the same lobby where I once walked out carrying a cardboard box, seeing my name on the executive floor again, taking part in decisions Henry could no longer control. There was satisfaction in the fantasy, and I did not shame myself for feeling it. Then I asked for time to think. On my way out, I passed the old operations corridor. That was where I saw the hard hat. It was sitting inside a glass display cabinet among photographs from Langford's early years. White plastic, scratched at the edge, my name printed across the front in black block letters. Jessica Langford. Henry had given it to me when I was young enough to still believe every promise adults made about the future. I remembered standing at one of his construction sites while he adjusted the strap because it was too large for my head. He told me that if I wanted the company one day, I had to understand it from the ground up. For years, I loved that memory because I thought it proved how much he believed in me. Standing there in 2026, I understood it differently. Henry had believed in a version of me, the daughter who would inherit his work, the executive who would challenge him professionally but obey him personally, the woman who would eventually become Langford without ever questioning his right to define what Langford meant. That girl had been real, but she was not me anymore. I left the hard hat in the cabinet. The next morning, I called the independent chairman and declined. He sounded genuinely surprised. You don't want to think longer? I already did. We can structure this around Cedar Bridge. That's not the issue. What is? I don't want my next chapter to be reclaiming my old one. He was quiet. I thanked him for the offer and told him I wanted Langford to succeed. I meant it. Hundreds of people worked there who had never hurt me. The company did not need to die for Henry to face consequences, but I also knew what returning would do to me. Every success would become another argument with my father, even if he was not in the room. Every promotion would feel like a correction to the past. Every decision would carry the temptation to prove I had always deserved the place he took away. I did not want to spend the rest of my career winning a trial. Henry no longer had the authority to judge. When I told Andre, he did not grin or say he knew I would turn them down. He only asked, "Are you sure?" "Yes." "What about the board seat?" "No. You know I would understand if you wanted it." "I know." That was why saying no felt clean. I had not refused Langford because Andre needed me at Cedar Bridge. Cedar Bridge would survive if I chose something else. I had not refused because I wanted to punish my father by rejecting his company. Henry was not even the person making the offer. I refused because I finally knew the difference between something I once wanted and something I still wanted. I kept the restitution. I kept the corrected record. I kept my Langford surname because it was mine before Henry ever decided what it meant. And I kept Cedar Bridge. Not because it was Andre's company where I happened to have a title, because I had built it with him. The conflict system that had forced me to recuse was mine. The controls that preserved the legitimacy of the investigation were mine. The operating structure that let independent people reach conclusions without asking whether I was Henry's daughter was mine. Andre had held the final signature, but the system that made that signature mean something had my fingerprints all over it. A few weeks have passed since then. Langford Commercial Group still exists. The acquisition is moving forward. Henry is completing the last part of his CEO transition. Amanda has started speaking to recruiters outside the company. My mother texts occasionally and is slowly learning that I no longer answer guilt with obedience. None of us has magically healed. I prefer that to a fake reunion. As for my father, I never gave him the answer he wanted in that boardroom. He told me he thought I would come back someday. He was right. I did come back. I came back through his records, through his board, through the company where he once told me I no longer belonged. I came back long enough to correct the story he wrote about me. Then, when Langford finally opened the door and offered me the future I had once begged myself not to miss, I was the one who walked away. Not because I had nowhere to stay, because I already had somewhere better to go. When a family asks you to accept disrespect in exchange for belonging, you need to understand that love without accountability can become control. You should not ignore discrimination, false records, financial harm, or manipulation just to keep the peace. Protect yourself by documenting important decisions, reading what you sign, asking questions when numbers do not make sense, and using proper legal or professional channels instead of relying on promises. You also need to remember that setting boundaries is not the same as seeking revenge. The strongest response is often to correct the record, recover what is rightfully yours, and let consequences come from the choices other people made. At the same time, do not let anger push you into bad decisions. Step away from conflicts when necessary, disclose your own mistakes, and make sure your actions can withstand independent scrutiny. If someone only respects you after discovering your value, status, or influence, that is not the same as genuine change. You deserve relationships built on respect before there is something to gain. Keep your dignity, protect your future, and do not confuse forgiveness with removing consequences. Your peace should never require surrendering basic fairness. If this story gave you something useful to think about, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories about family, choices, and accountability.